record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. And as a reminder to members participating remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves consistent with House rules, and staff will only mute members as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. And I see that we have a quorum, but I first also see that we have Representative Barbara Lee with us, who has been a true leader on these issues, and also just won an award at the NAACP Image Awards with a movie, with a documentary that just talks about her exemplary work here in the United States House of Representatives and even before. So it's an honor to have her with us today. And without objection, Representative Lee may participate in today's hearing after all our members have had their opportunity to question the witnesses. And without objection, I will enter your statement into the record. I now recognize myself for opening remarks. It has been over 2 decades since the 2001 AUMF was signed into law that has remained on the books to authorize military force in countries far beyond its original purpose, to go after al-Qaeda and extinguish their capacity to conduct terrorist attacks. I voted for that AUMF. I represent Queens, New York. We watched in horror, as all Americans did, as the Twin Towers were attacked and fell. I believe then, as I do now, that then President Bush needed military authorities that Congress was ready and willing to give. But, and I say this again, that was 2 decades ago. Since then, the 2001 AUMF has formed the basis for counterterrorism operations in over 20 countries, and at times against terrorist organizations that did not even exist when this AUMF was passed in the halls of Congress. In Somalia, we are currently fighting militants who were not yet born on 9/11 under the auspices of a terrorist group. Al-Shabaab, that did not exist when 9/11 was perpetrated, with weapons systems that were not invented when 9/11 occurred. Today's hearing is not intended to make the argument that we should cease counterterrorism operations around the globe. Far from it. The threats are real. The purpose of this hearing is to assess how we must replace the 2001 AUMF so that Congress, which alone is granted the power to declare war, reasserts that constitutional duty and no longer allows a 2-decade-old authorization to provide a blank check to administration after administration for military operations seemingly anywhere around the globe. We must conduct this assessment deliberately, ensuring that a 2001 AUMF replacement specifies targets of military operations so it may not be used to legally justify actions outside of Congress's intent. Ideally, it should specify countries where operations can take place, and it must find ways to provide operational flexibility to address the amorphous threat that now state terrorist groups pose, while not allowing administrations to excessively add new entities without congressional action. And yes, as the constitutional demands of our legislative branch that will require Congress to be more involved in matters of war and peace than it has been in 2 decades since 2001 AUMF was passed. A revision of the 2001 AUMF will require sunset clauses or periodic requirements for reauthorization, so it will not be yet another 20 years before Congress is asked to fill its constitutional obligation. These changes will also require greater transparency. It is crucial that any AUMF replacement include reporting requirements to Congress to bolster transparency so that it is clear that the administration is being forthright on its use of the authorities that it has been granted. Deciding on matters of war and peace is never easy, but it is our gravest duty as members of Congress to do so. The difficulty of that duty is no excuse for abdicating our responsibility to the executive branch. An overly broad AUMF left on the books is ripe for abuse. This last week, we've seen President Putin's Russia, a nuclear power, launch an unprovoked invasion on Ukraine. We should all remain mindful of the seriousness of war and its tremendous cost. We have a president that has demonstrated the leadership to unite our allies in defiance of Russia's belligerence, imposing swift economic consequences, but also a president who has demonstrated the restraint not to engage our military in the way that risks sparking the next world war. What of the next president, or the one after that? What of the next emerging conflict? We owe it to our constituents to represent their voice on where and when military force should be exercised, and we owe it to our armed forces. So it is time for Congress to claim the war powers authority it was granted by the Constitution, but somehow we surrendered it. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how we move forward together in legislating a replacement for the 2001 AUMF. We can do this, we should do this. It is our responsibility as members of Congress to make these very difficult and trying decisions. It is why we were elected, and we should not dodge it or give that responsibility away to anyone. I now recognize Ranking Member McCall for his opening statement.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate you having this hearing. We've been talking about this issue for a while, and I agree with you 100% that Congress has abdicated its responsibilities, and we exercise no power more solemn than committing our nation to war. I think the last time we did that was in World War II. Members on both sides of the aisle agree that it's time to reclaim our constitutional Article I responsibilities. Wars should not be on autopilot as they have been the last several decades, and Congress owes our troops a clear commitment to the missions that we are asking them to undertake. I've repeatedly stated that my desire to replace the 2001-2002 AUMFs with an updated authority scope to current terrorist threats. In fact, Republican members have had a discussion draft that we shared with you more than 6 months ago. And I think it's imperative to repeal and replace these AUMFs at the same time so there's no lapse in critical counterterrorism authorities. This will avoid sending a message of premature U.S. disengagement that could destabilize Iraq, embolden Iran, strengthen al-Qaeda and ISIS, and endanger Americans. In addition, President Biden must comply with the law requiring that he report twice a year on how we are using the AUMF. On Monday, DOD submitted some of these reports, but they still have not submitted the report due last December that would cover the disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal. Madam Secretary, as we have discussed the use of military force today, I also hope that you came prepared to answer questions about the administration's strategy for Ukraine. Obviously, that is the issue of the day. For months, I implored the Biden administration repeatedly to take Russia's renewed aggression against Ukraine seriously. And for months, very substantive actions were taken. In a decision, though, that still baffles me, President Biden waived congressionally mandated sanctions on the Russian influence project, Nord Stream 2, in May. Let me be clear, enriching Vladimir Putin and making Europe more energy dependent on Russian natural gas is absolutely not in Americans' quote, national interest. It's frustrating it took a full-scale renewed invasion for the president to reverse his decision on these sanctions. At the same time, Putin was allowed to build up nearly 200,000 Russian troops near Ukraine's border with no consequences. We were told by President Biden that sanctions at that time were not needed, that the threat of sanctions would deter Russia. But clearly, I believe the president was wrong here. We are now facing what is truly the nightmare scenario, the largest war in Europe since World War II. But I believe there's still hope. President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people are inspiring the world as they risk their lives by standing in front of tanks like Tiananmen Square to defend their country. Vladimir Putin has underestimated the strength and the bravery and the resiliency of the Ukrainian people to his own peril. But the courage of the Ukrainian people is one thing, but they need our help. As President Zelensky reminded us over the weekend, he doesn't need a ride out of his country. He needs lethal weapons to fight for his country, to fight for his people. I'm pleased the administration has finally begun to enact significant sanctions on Russia. And while I still believe we should have used some of these sanctions before the invasion, the actions we are taking now are sending a powerful message not only to Russia, but to our adversaries around the world. But I believe more is still needed. Most importantly, secondary sanctions on designated Russian banks. This forces countries to choose between business with us or business with Russia. Furthermore, President Biden must stop American dollars from funding Putin's war machine by cutting off U.S. imports of Russian oil. Energy exports are the lifeblood of the Russian economy, and we should not be allowing Putin to use that lifeblood to spill blood in Ukraine. We also need to isolate Russia diplomatically as well as economically. Yet President Biden is reportedly still attempting to finalize a Russian-brokered Iran deal. It should be obvious that Russia should not be serving as one of the key brokers on an Iran nuclear deal while they are waging war against Ukraine. There's absolutely no chance Russia has U.S. national security interest in mind when it looks at Iran's nuclear program. And I just came back from Israel, and I believe the Knesset and the Prime Minister agree with me. It is gravely concerning the administration apparently doesn't want Congress to review their new deal. Bypassing congressional review of any Iran nuclear deal, especially one brokered by Putin, would be a violation of U.S. law. So with that, Mr. Chairman, again, these are grave times. I think since you've taken the chairmanship, and these are dangerous times, and it calls for action, and it also calls for bipartisan action. And I'm also just pleased to announce that we have agreed to a sense of Congress supporting the people of Ukraine against Putin and Russians' aggression. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall, and I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm pleased with the bipartisan resolution that we should be voting on the floor today to send a loud and clear voice to Vladimir Putin and all those thugs that he has around him that the United States Congress is united against him and with the people of Ukraine. With that, I'll now introduce our witnesses. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman was confirmed by the Senate on April 13, 2021, and sworn in as the 21st and first female Deputy Secretary of State on April 14, 2021. From 2020 to 2050, she served as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the Department of State and previously served as the State Department as Counselor under Secretary Madeleine Albright, as Special Advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Policy Coordinator on North Korea, and as an Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs under Secretary Warren Christopher. Next, we have Richard Visek, is the Acting Legal Advisor in the Office of the Legal Advisor at the Department of State. He previously served as the Assistant Legal Advisor for European and Eurasian Affairs and as the Legal Assistant Advisor for Employment Law, and previously worked for the U.S. Department of Justice in private practice with the firm Hogan and Harston. Next is Christopher P. Maier. He is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. He previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism and worked on the National Security Council. And last, but far from least, we have Ms. Caroline Krass. She is the General Counsel for the Department of Defense. She has previously served as an Acting Assistant Attorney General for the Department of Justice, worked in the Office of Legal Counsel, and served as Deputy Legal Advisor for the National Security Council and an attorney in the Department of State. I want to thank each and every one of you, A, for your service to our great nation, and B, of course, for being here this morning. Now, let me also say, while all of the witnesses submitted written testimony, it is my understanding that only Deputy Secretary Sherman will give oral statement, thereby allowing more time for member questions as the witnesses have a hard stop at 1:30. And I understand that given all of the events occurring in the world, the Deputy Secretary's remarks will go over the normal 5 minutes, but since the others are yielding some time to the Secretary, she will be well within the time frame. And I will allow her for these extended remarks, given that they are saving time with other witnesses foregoing their opening remarks. All the witnesses, with Assistant Secretary Maier and General Counsel Krass submitting jointly, have provided written statements, and without objection, their written statements will be made part of the record. And I now recognize Deputy Secretary Sherman for her opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me and my colleagues to testify today. As the chairman noted, this opening statement is on behalf of all of us on this panel. President Biden is committed to engaging with Congress on questions of war and peace, and to being transparent about when, where, why, and how the United States uses military force. The President has committed as well to working with Congress to ensure that outdated authorizations for the use of military force are replaced with a narrow and specific framework that will ensure we will continue to protect Americans from terrorist threats. We are here today to discuss the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, which was passed shortly after the September 11th attacks. But this hearing does, as both the chairman and the ranking member have said, has a broader purpose too. And that is to demonstrate to the world how democracies, how great powers should discuss and consider the solemn and weighty responsibilities that come with using military force, guided by facts, transparency, and the rule of law. The 2001 AUMF authorizes the President to use all necessary and appropriate force against those he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the September 11th attacks, or those who harbored such organizations or persons. The Biden administration recognizes, as the administrations before us did, that this is not a blank check, and the 2001 AUMF does not authorize the President to use force against every terrorist group in the world. That is why the administration has provided Congress with a complete list of all groups that have been determined to be covered by the 2001 AUMF and reports every 6 months on activities conducted pursuant to this AUMF. The most recent report, which was signed by President Biden on December 7th, is also available on the White House website. We also recognize that fully 2 decades after it was enacted, that the 2001 AUMF has been used in ways that Congress and even the executive branch did not fully anticipate at the time it was passed. Given all of this, Congress and the executive branch should work together to replace or revise the 2001 AUMF in a way that ensures that the United States can continue in an uninterrupted fashion to respond effectively to terrorist threats, even as the source and level of threats to our national security changes. And we do continue to face serious threats. Just last month, President Biden ordered a military raid that resulted in the death of the leader of ISIS, Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurayshi. That raid relied on the 2001 AUMF, which has been the cornerstone of the counterterrorism effort against ISIS and al-Qaeda. So it is critically important that we maintain a congressional authorization to use military force against ISIS, al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups that threaten our national security interest. The President also has authorities under Article 2 of the Constitution, which he has relied on to use force against certain Iran-aligned militia groups. We will, of course, consult Congress in the event the nature of the threat from Iran-aligned militia groups changes and the President determines new authorities are needed to effectively address that threat. Finally, as regards the AUMF, the President has been very clear that the United States reserves the inherent right to use necessary and proportionate force in self-defense if we are attacked. I've already noted that a new or revised AUMF should provide uninterrupted authority to continue operations currently authorized by statute that the President and Congress determine are necessary to protect our national security. In addition, Congress should consider establishing mechanisms and standards that address how the AUMF will apply to terrorist groups beyond those that may be named in the text, and that include periodic review of the groups subject to the use of force and locations where force is used under the AUMF. We are also open to further engaging with Congress on the issue of locations in which force can be used and how a periodic review process should be structured. We look forward to an ongoing dialogue with Congress as we work together to determine what a new or revised authorization for the use of military force should look like. In addition, this morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members, and those listening, I want to speak to the situation briefly in Ukraine and to the horrifying war of choice that Russian President Vladimir Putin has unleashed there. As we meet, Russian forces, on the order of President Putin, are carrying out a premeditated, unprovoked, and unjustified attack on Ukraine, violating international law, endangering international security, causing widespread death, destruction, and devastation. The United States is united with Ukraine. We saw that last night in the standing ovation by all members of Congress in solidarity with Ukraine. We are cooperating with our allies and partners to provide robust and ongoing security assistance, humanitarian assistance, and diplomatic support to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And we are simultaneously working in lockstep with our allies and partners to impose massive costs and consequences on the Russian Federation, as well as on President Putin and his enablers for their unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. You heard this morning from spokesperson Jen Psaki that no options are off the table, except the President has made clear that U.S. troops will not be engaged in the conflict inside Ukraine. Make no mistake, the responsibility for this war lies with one man and one man alone. That man is Vladimir Putin, who can sit comfortably in his dacha in Sochi while ordinary Ukrainians and Russians bear the brutal consequences of his actions. President Biden has been very clear, as I said, that American forces are not and will not be engaged in the conflict with Russia inside Ukraine. The President has ordered additional forces to Europe to defend our NATO allies and provide reassurance to our allies on the eastern flank. Our allies have also stepped up their forces and capabilities to ensure our collective defense. Every step we are taking is being undertaken in full consultation with Congress, as well as with our allies and partners, and as authorized by Congress. This is a critical, difficult, and I agree, Congressman McCall, a dangerous time, as the chairman has said as well. We are all glad to be here this morning to talk about America's use of military force. We are ready to engage with you on the questions that you have, and we thank you for inviting us here today at this very consequential time in our democracy and in democracies around the world to testify and to take your questions. Thank you.
I now recognize members for 5 minutes each pursuant to House rules, and all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. Please note that I will be strict in enforcing the 5-minute time limitation for questioning, as I would like to get as many members in before the 1:30 hard stop. I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. So in the events in Ukraine are foremost on many people's minds this morning, not just in this committee, but in this Congress, this country, and indeed around the world. And President Putin's illegal, reprehensible violation of Ukraine's sovereignty will not stand and shall not ever be forgotten. Directly after this hearing, I will be leading a floor debate on the bipartisan resolution that Mr. McCall and I worked very diligently on. And it reaffirms the House's staunch, steadfast, and unwavering support for Ukraine and its people. I want to briefly address legal questions surrounding war powers in this conflict. First, let me ask Deputy Secretary Sherman, does the Biden administration intend, I heard you in your opening statement, but I'm going to ask the question, does the Biden administration intend to send the American military into Ukraine? And my next two questions are both for General Counsel Krass and Legal Advisor Visek. And please be brief in your responses, as I have some other questions to come in the limited time. First, can the 2001 AUMF be applied to Russian aggression in Europe?
No.
Ms. Kraus.
No.
With that, Shavit, that the President has Article 2 powers as Commander-in-Chief, would the President need to come to Congress for war authorization were he to introduce American forces into European-based conflict with Russia?
The President has no intention of sending troops into Ukraine.
Thank you. Legal Advisor Visek, I have one other further question for you. Do you agree that Congress needs to have knowledge of important military operations that may take place under the 2001 AUMF?
Yes.
Now, I raise these merely to point out that this committee, of course, has been slow to receive the 1550 reports on where, how, and against whom the 2001 AUMF has been used against both of the last two administrations. And I truly appreciate that we did receive some backlogged reports from this administration. But I just want to encourage more punctual reporting going forward. Congress cannot uphold its constitutional responsibilities without this critical information. So now I'll just go ask Ms. Krass, how should members of Congress think about the trade-off between giving the executive branch latitude to adjust to the facts on the ground about ever-evolving terrorist functions while trying to provide specific and clear guidance over who can be targeted under a new AUMF?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that question highlights the complexity of replacing the outdated AUMF with a new and flexible framework, and we'll need to build in mechanisms such that we can continue to evolve with the threat that confronts us as that threat evolves.
And that's something that this committee would love to work with you on, because we need to make sure that we have it correctly, so that the President has some flexibility, but you can't get around the authorization that we have and the responsibilities that we have as members of Congress. Mr. Maier, The terrorist threat in Africa is rapidly evolving and involves a complex landscape of branches, networks, and splinter organizations that have indirect, nebulous ties to al-Qaeda or ISIS. The formation of new, sometimes rival terrorist organizations with unclear alliances is common. Given the role of U.S. troops in training, equipping, and sometimes accompanying African partner forces in combating these terrorist threats in Africa, how is the administration ensuring that the use of force incidents are properly categorized and reported to Congress in a timely fashion while maintaining the proper level of operation security to reduce the risk of mission and forces?
So, Mr. Chairman, we have a robust reporting requirement that we conduct regularly, including under the 130F program. So within 24 hours of an operation, there's a report up to Congress that's followed up 7 days later with a more comprehensive report.
Thank you. And my time has expired. I now move to the Ranking Member McCall for his question.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just, seems to me that Article 2 is being exercised because we don't have an AUMF sufficient to, particularly when it comes to Iranian Shia proxies. So I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that anything if we want to update this AUMF, we look at where Article 2 has been exercised and provide an updated AUMF. As I came back from Israel, it's the threat from Iran that's changed since 9/11. Secretary Sherman, I know you can't answer this question, but I hope you'll take back to the President the message that we should not be importing Russian energy into the United States because it is a lifeblood for Putin that is spilling blood in Ukraine as we speak. Last night we heard from the President about his $1 billion in security assistance over the past year, and that sounds impressive. I want to kind of dig into that a little bit. From the start, though, out of fear of being provocative, we have delayed a military aid package to Ukraine during the aggressive Russian troop movements along Ukraine's border last spring. And that package wasn't approved until President Zelensky visited the United States months later in August. Then Congress had to plus up this budget request for security assistance for Ukraine twice. And as the Russian military buildup around Ukraine once again escalated in autumn, a $200 million lethal aid package was eligible to be delivered to Ukraine as soon as December 3rd, 2021. It sat on the President's desk for a month. Shipments to Ukrainians should have been flowing, in my judgment, throughout December, not starting in January. Instead, that December, the department officials were fully invested in a strategic security dialogue with Russia to discuss Ukraine, while President Zelensky pressed President Biden on the urgent need for these weapons. To make matters worse, these deliveries were completed just weeks ago in mid-February, days before the full-scale renewed Russian invasion began. We also learned that the President had access to $250 million in additional emergency lethal security assistance under the Foreign Assistance Act that could have been provided to Ukraine once a policy determination was made that Ukraine was, quote, a victim of active aggression. This administration waited to make that determination until February 24th. How this administration didn't determine that Ukraine was a victim of active aggression months earlier as Russia amassed 190,000 troops around its border makes no sense. And now Secretary Austin, Secretary of Defense, tells us that we have been warning, that what we have been warning for months, that's going to be really difficult now after the invasion to get additional lethal aid to Ukraine as this war rages. And I agree with him. And that is precisely why I've called for sending more weapons before a Russian invasion rather than trying to get in after. And as we witness the bravery and the courage of Ukraine's freedom fighters in the face of Russian brutality, I can't understand why we failed to send more lethal weapons sooner when we had the weapons in stock and the capability to get them directly in the hands of these forces that desperately needs them. So Secretary Sherman, or for the whole panel, first of all, why did why wasn't this done sooner? And I know we can't change the past. Why wasn't this done sooner? And as we travel to Poland, what can we do to get them the weapons they desperately need?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I'll make a couple comments, and then my colleague from the Department of Defense may want to follow up as well. We have, as you noted, committed $1 billion in security assistance to Ukraine in the past year alone. And that has been over this entire year. And since 2014, $3 billion in security assistance. So it is not accurate to say we waited only until Russia attacked Ukraine to provide these lethal weapons. We have done this with your support, for which we are very grateful, and your concurrence and consultation. Secondly, we understand the challenges to getting weapons in the middle of a conflict, but I can assure you, Congressman, that those weapons are getting in, even now. There are many ways that we have to do this, and I am in awe always of the Department of Defense's ability, working with our diplomats, to in fact do this. Third, on your trip to Poland, first and foremost, thank you to Poland. They are being just extraordinary, welcoming the vast majority of refugees over their border. We're now probably close to 700,000 refugees, to provide humanitarian assistance, to help deliveries, as are other countries. But I want to be very careful here this morning, Congressman. I don't want to talk much about how we're doing what we're doing, because I want to keep civilians, diplomats, our military, and other parts of our government safe during a very, very difficult situation. But more than anything, I want to thank you all. $610 million worth of arms and equipment direct from DoD stocks under the Presidential Drawdown Authority since August 2021. $86 million in nonproliferation, anti-terrorism, demining, and related programs to assistance to Ukraine. $168 million in assistance to law enforcement reform and border security, additional equipment deliveries under U.S. excess defense articles, and, I must say, many third-party transfers that are being asked of us from countries all over Europe, including Germany, which generally does not like to do this. So this has been just an extraordinary effort worldwide. Assistant Secretary Maier, anything you want to add?
The gentleman's time has expired, and he's gone over, and I gave him that courtesy as the ranking member. But I do want to give due notice to the rest of the members. I will not be as courteous. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Representative Brad Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Picking up on the ranking member's comment, I hope that our deliveries to Ukraine are sufficient to deal with what may be a very long-term guerrilla war. We have the Ukrainian government controls the Ukraine-Poland border entries today. There's no assurance that's true 3 or 4 weeks from now. So you have 3 or 4 weeks to get in enough weapons to support a 10-year guerrilla war, if that's what it takes to drive Russia out. One hopes that it doesn't take that long. But Russia, the Soviet Union, 100 months in Afghanistan, 100 casualties a month, and then we know what happened. Turning to the purpose of today's hearing, I'll ask Secretary Sherman, but the rest. Other administrations have taken the position that the War Powers Act is a nice thing, kind of not a a non-binding resolution, something that, it's good if it happens. Others say it's a law. As a matter of fact, that has been the position of Congress since we passed the law over at administration's veto. Does this administration regard the law as binding on them? Madam Secretary?
This administration certainly supports both the Constitution of the United States and the laws of the United States.
Is the War Powers Act a constitutional law binding on the administration, or do you think that the Constitution prevents it from being binding on you?
I think the War Powers Act is very critical, and I defer to my legal counsel.
Legal counsel.
Thank you.
Because I know where Senator Biden was. Where is President Biden on this?
Thank you, Congressman. Obviously,
This is a yes or no. I have limited time.
we apply, certainly we act consistently.
Please, filibustering's, that's for the Senate.
We act consistently with.
Yes or no?
and
Is this,
abide by the law.
is it your legal, I know you believe in following the law, and I know the Constitution is also the law of the country. Is this law constitutional and binding on the president, or are we spending our time arguing about whether to authorize something that you think you're authorized to do, whether we authorize it or not?
Congressman,
Please pull the mic closer to you.
sorry. Congressman, I have not, during this administration, had an opportunity to talk to my colleagues about that very question. It just hasn't come up.
How would you come to a hearing about whether to authorize, whether to change an authorization to use military force if you don't have an opinion on whether such authorization is necessary or of any legal consequence?
Congressman, let me be very clear. We hope and want to work with the Congress to revise and replace the authorization. for
Right,
use of
but if you
military
take the
force.
position that you get to do whatever you want, whether we
no, no.
authorize it or not, or you
No, no.
refuse to, or you refuse, well, if you dance around the issue of whether you need an authorization, then this is a discussion about something you will treat as a non-binding resolution. I'm sure you love all our non-binding resolutions, and you like to work with us about them, but if you won't recognize the constitutionality of the War Powers Act, you have a imperial presidency approach consistent with prior administrations.
Congressman, on the existing 2001 AUMF, we have consistently reported what we have done. We have consistently
There are many
followed
non-binding
our
resolutions
responsibility.
that you comply with, but you don't think you have to. Let me go. Since in 2012, I authored a provision that is now part of the every appropriations bill that says you cannot spend money in contravention of the War Powers Act. We've had a former Attorney General, Republican Attorney General, sit right there and say that with that provision, you must comply with the War Powers Act, or you're basically just stealing money and not using it for what Congress has allowed it to be spent for. Have you looked at that provision?
I have not looked at that provision.
Well, since
I will
if
take a look at it now.
Congress appropriates money and says you can't spend it for something, and you do that, that's a violation of criminal law. So I hope that you would look at it before you violate it. And with that, I'd simply say we ought to be repealing the 2001 AUMF. There's no reason to replace it. There are many reasons why you might want to deploy troops into hostile situations, and if you do, please come here and ask. You have 60 days to do that, and we ought to restore the Constitution
Gentleman's time
here
has
today.
expired. I now recognize Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In a 2014 speech to a joint session of Congress, we'll all recall, Ukrainian President Poroshenko pleaded with the Obama administration for military assistance, which he didn't get, and he got a standing ovation when he did, and when he made the request to defend against Putin's invasion of Crimea. And he famously said, one cannot win the war with blankets. Last June, as Russia deployed more combat forces on Ukraine's border, Politico and others reported that a modest military aid package had been put on hold. Key items under consideration for the package included short-range air defense missile systems, small arms, and more anti-tank weapons. Can you tell us, Madam Secretary, tell the committee, what Ukrainian President Zelensky asked for over the past year, including air defense systems? What did he get and what didn't he get? Delay is denial. Were there any delays? Will you give us the timeline of Ukrainian requests that were met and those that weren't, and when they were met? Secondly, as we push to prosecute Putin and other top officials as war criminals, his partner in these crimes against humanity include Belarus dictator Alexander Lukashenko, and he must be prosecuted as well. I've authored 4 Belarus democracy and human rights laws over the years that sanction Lukashenko and others around him, in 2004, 2006, 2011, and we did it together here on 2020. Now he's also committing crimes against his own people, which he's done now against the Ukrainians as well. Third, noticeably absent from his State of the Union speech last night, President Biden did not explain nor give any accounting whatsoever, or any update to the American people on the administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan and what is being done to repatriate Americans and our Afghan allies left behind. How many Americans remain in Afghanistan? Why were they forgotten last night? How many Americans remain in Ukraine? Because again, fast forward, we're worried about that, especially given the Afghanistan record. Fourth, why were the oppressed peoples of China, including Hong Kongers, Christians, Falun Gong practitioners, Tibetan Buddhists, the genocide by Xi Jinping against the Muslim Uyghurs, and the existential threat to Taiwan not even addressed? And finally, there was no mention of our great friend and ally who is perpetually at risk, our ally Israel. I yield for the answers.
Thank you very much. I'll try to tick through many questions as quickly as I can, Congressman. First of all, let me say you have always been a champion for human rights and remain so, whether that is human rights in China or human rights in Belarus, and we applaud you and join you in our concerns for people's human rights all over the world, and I thank you for your leadership in this arena. Secondly, on the timeline of our giving weapons to Ukraine and meeting President Zelensky's ask, President Biden is talking with President Zelensky on a regular basis, virtually daily these days, and we are trying to give him everything that he has asked for understandable reasons. And indeed, President Biden has given $1 billion in security assistance with your support and authorization in the last year, more than any other president has done in any preceding year.
With respect, if I could just interrupt for a second. We left $80 billion to the Taliban. This is 1/80th of that amount against a superpower with a very credible military that's destroying everybody. And so, you know, $1 billion is $1 billion, but what did he really ask for? We don't have any idea. Over the year.
We can certainly delineate in a classified setting, and I believe that Undersecretary Toria Nuland is now scheduled to give a classified briefing to this committee, I think Wednesday of next week. So we will be able to get in more detail in classified setting. We would not in an open setting, Congressman. On Belarus, we quite agree with you. We believe the sanctions against Belarus are critical for their complicity in this situation. On Afghanistan, let me tell you that we are aware that there are roughly 182 U.S. citizens in Afghanistan who we remain in touch with. Since August 31st, we have helped at least 496 American citizens leave Afghanistan and 455 locally employed LPRs, as we call them. I'm sorry, legally permanent residents. So Americans who are legally permanent here in the United States, not LES, which are locally employed citizens. So 496 American citizens and 455 LPRs. We have not forgotten Americans in Afghanistan. That effort continues to this day to bring anyone home who wants to come home. We have many ways we can help achieve that, and we help Americans to do that every single day. We do not forget people. We have not forgotten Americans in Ukraine. We told Americans repeatedly over many months, to leave Ukraine. We made available to them even loans so that they could take commercial airlines. So we are doing everything we possibly can, Congressman. We share your concern.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thanks, Chair.
I now recognize Representative Jerry Connolly of Virginia, who's the president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel. I must say, Ms. Sherman, welcome. Good to see you again. Do you know what the word chutzpah means?
Of course I do.
What's that?
Of course I do.
You do. So I think you were hearing a little bit of it just before I arrived here. I've been watching it upstairs in my office. The idea that the Biden administration delayed lethal weapons to Ukraine from people who had no problem with the previous president not only preventing such weapons from going to Ukraine,
but actually trying to extort a political favor from Ukrainian leadership in exchange, for which he was impeached. I call that chutzpah of the highest order. I just thought I'd get that out there. Ms. Sherman, I also believe that the Biden administration deserves enormous credit. And I can tell you this wearing my own NATO perch hat. I've never seen the kind of cohesion in NATO and the European Union that we have seen in this crisis. And I want to give you the opportunity maybe to describe a little bit what the Biden administration did to help that along, because it is unprecedented. The sanctions that are being imposed, the weaponry that's being provided by the EU as well as NATO allies, unprecedented. And it's all on the Biden administration's watch, and surely you all had something to do with that, I assume.
Thank you very much, Congressman. When President Biden became President of the United States, one of the things that he said was absolutely critical was to reconnect to our alliances and to our partners around the world. And he asked Secretary Blinken to make that the highest priority because our power, which is immense, is even greater when we work with others. We teach our children to work and play well with others, and the President wanted to make sure that we not only played well with others, but we used that combined power to move forward the democratic values that we hold so dear. So we have been involved nonstop in engagement with our partners and allies. Secretary Blinken makes endless phone calls during the week, any week, and travels to engage our allies and partners. I talk to my counterparts every single week. Right now, Undersecretary Nuland is talking to her G7 political directors every single morning at, I think, 7 a.m. We have held CIVITS's, secure video conferences, with our NATO partners, with our EU partners, and quite frankly, with partners around the world. You all have helped. I know that many of you have made calls to ambassadors here, have traveled to places in the world, have gone to the Munich Security Conference, and I thank the bipartisan delegation that went to Munich because it said to Europe, it said to others who were there from around the world that we were together, that this alliance mattered, that the NATO alliance mattered. I have to tell you, Congressman, I represented our country at the NATO-Russia Council meeting. It was a 4-hour meeting. 30 countries in front of the Russian delegation that were there said all the same things. They were for sovereignty, territorial integrity, the right of a country to make its own political choices and its own foreign policy choices, to determine its own future. It was one of the most moving events I have ever been part of because the unanimity, the solidarity, the power, there was no question that the Russians knew in that moment that we could not be divided. And the same happened at the Foreign Affairs Council as well of the European Union.
Well, let me just say to you, because my time is about to run out, I couldn't agree with you more. And Munich is fine, but remember that the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which represents hundreds of parliamentarians of all 30 NATO members, plus our partners, including Ukraine, showed the same unanimity, no matter what political party or spectrum they came from. And I think it was also an opportunity, and I congratulate the administration, for reasserting America's role in a different way, but reasserting it after years of questioning and troubled statements coming from the president, previous president. So thank you for your leadership, and thank you to the president.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Steve Shabbat of Ohio, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I get to my first question, I would remind my dear friend from the Commonwealth of Virginia, who has been an extraordinary leader in never recognizing the Russians stealing Crimea, essentially, along with myself, but relative, there are actions, there are words. They always say actions speak louder than words, and the Obama administration provided meals ready to eat, MREs, and blankets. And what the Ukrainians were requesting was lethal weaponry, and it was actually the Trump administration that provided lethal weapons. So the actions, I think, speak louder than the words. Secretary
Would my
Sherman,
friend just yield for a compliment?
very, very quick.
I just want to, I want to thank you for being a stalwart on Crimea. Both of us said back in 2014, never. And that became enshrined in appropriations legislation and others. So thank you for your leadership in this matter.
Thank you very much, and right back at you. Secretary Sherman, in the lead up to the most recent Russian invasion, I say recent obviously because they invaded Crimea and the Donbas region, the Ukrainians' top request was for anti-aircraft weapons. We'd been asking the administration for months if the U.S. had Stinger missiles to send Ukraine, but we're told we did not have an exportable version in stock. Yet it's now being reported that the U.S. has approved the direct delivery of Stinger missiles to Ukraine as part of a recent package. Can you explain why it took Kyiv being on the verge of being overrun by Russian forces to determine the U.S. could indeed directly export Stingers to Ukraine?
I'm going to defer to my DoD colleague, Assistant Secretary Maier, about the technology of Stinger missiles, which he probably understands better than I do. I do think it is important to emphasize that we can only go so far in this open session to talk about specific weapon systems.
Let's go right to it because I got limited time. Yes.
Sure, Congressman. So there's technical changes that have to be made for an export version. I won't get into any more details than that, but this has been an ongoing conversation, as Deputy Secretary Sherman said, about a whole range of different support to Ukraine.
All right. Well, we need to do everything possible to get them what they need as quickly as possible. Let me ask you this. We've all been watching on our televisions and feeling helpless about this 40-mile-long procession of lethal Russian tanks and military vehicles and you name it, heading for Kyiv. And we know they're going to be using those to bludgeon and murder women, children, civilians, anything that breathes, basically, once it gets there. A number of members, both in the House and the Senate, have been urging the administration to at least consider, we've got decommissioned, surplus, mothballed, to us obsolete planes, some, the A-10 Warthog, tank killers. And essentially, my understanding is, got zero response from the administration. For months, they've been suggesting, let's get these over to help the Ukrainians. They're not there. They've got no way at this point to stop those tanks from coming down, that they know are going to be killing their people. Why the heck have we not done something? Why was the administration silent on this? What the heck's going on?
So again, Congressman, I think there's a critical element of what we can supply and what the Ukrainians can absorb here. Some of the platforms you're talking about, they have no expertise in. So I think this has been an ongoing conversation of which many of the capabilities we've applied and supplied to them are ones that they can absorb and then put into the fight.
Well, it's just, I think it's incredible to me that we haven't found a way to do this. And the number of people's lives that would have been saved if we could have planned better earlier. This is all, the blood is on Putin's hands, but the incompetence of this administration is breathless. Let me, I'm almost out of time. One last thing, I happen to be the co-chair of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, and obviously the Russians, the Chinese have been watching, and one thing they've probably learned from this is when they go after Taiwan, they better go very quickly. So I hope to heck this administration is thinking very seriously about the defense of Taiwan, a key ally and a key part of the world for us. And
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative David Cicilline for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing. I just want to say that I, like Mr. Conley, am very delighted to see that my Republican colleagues have found their voices on the importance of getting arms to Ukraine, since I don't remember a single member on the Republican side of this committee saying one word when the prior president delayed delivery of armaments and ammunition to Ukraine to defend themselves because he couldn't extort a corrupt act in his political campaign. And I'm glad you found your voices, and that's gratifying. But I want to say thank you to the administration. No, I will not.
Mr. Chairman.
I will not.
That's not correct.
I will not yield,
President
Mr.
Trump provided
Mr. Wilson,
that.
I have the floor. I want to say thank you to the Biden administration for the work that you have done to demonstrate the importance of NATO and to re-engage with our NATO partners. We were living in a time not long ago when we had a president saying NATO was obsolete and doing everything he could to undermine this important defensive organization. So thank you to President Biden and to Deputy Secretary Sherman and your team. Finally, I want to say that we had the opportunity to be in Ukraine recently to meet with the defense minister, the foreign minister, the head of intelligence, and the president, and most of the discussion was about economic assistance. No one ever suggested that the United States was not doing everything it could to provide all of the support militarily that we could, and that is continuing. So the notion that we're not doing that is just incorrect. And thank you to everyone who's been part of that effort. Now let's focus on the question before this committee today in this hearing, and that is the AUMF. Deputy Secretary Sherman, Mr. Sherman asked you about whether or not the president or the administration believes it would need an authorization to engage militarily in the conflict in Ukraine. You said the president has no intention of sending troops. We understand that. Do I presume from that answer that you do agree that if he intended to engage directly with troops or military action, it would require authorization from Congress?
I think, as you all know, the president served as a senator in Congress for many years, and he understands the authorities that are very critical to the Congress and to the executive branch.
I take it you're not going to answer that question. Let me ask you then, you said before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that President Biden would ensure that outdated authorizations for the use of military force are replaced with narrow and specific frameworks back in August of last year. Would you describe what you consider narrow and specific replacements would be that the Biden administration would support?
Sure. As you noted, we've suggested a narrow and specific framework that will ensure that Americans are continually protected from terrorist attacks. We would be open to discussing with you all the contours of a newer updated AUMF. We believe it should provide uninterrupted authority, as I've said. In addition, in any updated or replacement AUMF, Congress should consider establishing mechanisms and standards that, one, address how it will apply to terrorist groups beyond those that may be identified by name in the text of an AUMF, and two, include periodic review of the groups that are subject to the use of force and the locations where force is to be used. We are further open to engaging with you on the issue of locations in which force can be used and how a periodic review process should be structured. These are very complex issues involving a lot of lawyers to get to the final answer. I'm not a lawyer, just to make sure everybody understands that. We think there should be periodic review of locations, periodic review of groups, and we are happy to discuss how that process might be structured.
And Deputy Secretary Sherman, would the Biden administration support sunset clauses in a replacement or revision of the 2001 AUMF?
We actually do not support an automatic sunset provision, including because we're concerned about the signal it would send to our adversaries. We think the periodic review will get to the concern that Congress has, that you are constantly engaged in updating lists, locations, and groups. But we do not want to say to our adversaries at some date, if they just hold out, they can do whatever they please. They cannot.
Thank you. You know, I think the fundamental question surrounding the 2001 AUMF is how we balance the needs of the executive branch and the commander-in-chief to keep us safe, while at the same time keeping intact the powers endowed to Congress to conduct oversight of the executive branch and to declare war. And so as we continue to go through this process, I invite your thoughts on how we balance those two priorities in a way that allows us to fulfill our responsibilities and also allows the president to fulfill his. And with that, I thank you again for being here, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and I want to apologize to the gentleman because I made a mistake. I know how humbled you are about Rhode Island. I said Maine, but the gentleman is from Rhode Island. So I
Mr.
wanna
Chairman,
make sure the record
yes,
was clear.
that, I didn't even hear that. It would have been so deeply offensive to me. But I have a unanimous consent request. I'd ask unanimous consent that the report from the Watson Institute at Brown University, the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, a comprehensive look at where and how it has been used, be part of the record.
Without objection. I now recognize Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Sherman, it's good to see you. I've enjoyed working with you, promoting our relationship with the European Union. And gosh, who would ever imagine 2 days ago, the European Union, for the first time ever, has agreed to military assistance to President Vladimir Zelensky and the people of Ukraine. And so what an achievement, and I'm so excited. Also, the administration is reportedly in the end stages of negotiating the absurd nuclear deal with Iran. In the past, I've been grateful to work bipartisan with former Chairman Eliot Engel, with Senator Joe Lieberman, to oppose what really turned out to be an insane agreement of providing money to a regime that is the great state sponsor of terrorism, which is such a risk, particularly with our open borders today. Anyone who says this is a return to the 2016 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is mistaken. Iran cannot unlearn the technical capacity and knowledge that it has masked for its violations of JCPOA nuclear limitations over the past few years. It has been enriching uranium at 60% purity. Its stockpile of enriched uranium is many times as that allowed by the limits, and its nuclear research and centrifuge manufacturing have gone beyond the limits. It has violated its commitments to categorically forego certain research and development and enrichment activities. It has never stopped its efforts to develop ICBMs, missiles, which can only to achieve their goal of death to Israel and death to America. With that, in the words of the IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi, quote, "You cannot put the genie back in the bottle. Once you know how to do stuff, you know the Iranian program has grown, become more sophisticated, so the linear return to 2015 is no longer possible," end of quote. Sadly, career State Department employees have sounded the alarm that the Iranian regime may have access to billions of dollars as soon as Monday, as Rob Malley plans to lift sanctions, bypassing Congress. Being that this is a new agreement, is the administration prepared to bring this, and because it is U.S. law, is it prepared to bring this back to Congress for Congress to have a voice in the interest of the American people?
So, Congressman, first of all, we don't know whether there will be a return to compliance by Iran to the JCPOA. I know from my own experience that this is a binary thing. You either get there or you don't, and unless the last piece of the puzzle comes into place, it doesn't happen. We are well aware of the timeline and our concerns about what Iran is doing, and so there is not forever to negotiate. We are, in fact, at a very crucial moment, so we agree with you to that extent. In terms of coming to Congress, this administration is committed to following INARA, and if an agreement requires us to return to Congress to get a review by Congress under INARA, we will do so.
Well, please do. And Secretary Maier, the $350 million of security assistance this week that I appreciate the President providing, has it been delivered? And gosh, we're so grateful for our allies of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, the adjacent countries, all participating in providing the equipment. What is the status of delivery?
So, Congressman, that's part of a larger package that's already been talked to of the $1 billion. I don't have the specifics, nor would I want to talk to them in this forum about what actually has been delivered, but it's been a constant effort to get these in as expediently as possible, these munitions and other elements of support. Well,
President Vladimir Zelensky has just been such an inspiration to all the countries adjacent to him, and it's so inspiring. Another question I have, I don't know if you can discuss it here, but Harpoon missiles. There is the Black Sea Fleet, and their potential attack on Odessa.
So, Congressman, I think that's something we shouldn't talk about in this forum, but as the Deputy Secretary reinforced, there's no intent for U.S. forces to be engaged with Russian forces.
Well, I don't want us to, I want us to provide the equipment, okay, for the people, for the very courageous and valiant people of Ukraine. And, but indeed, we do want the agreement back with Iran, who is not going to follow through, to come to Congress. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Ami Bera of California, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I don't normally engage in the banter between parties, but just this last week, having had to listen to some of my colleagues on the other side, this is a time for us to come together as a nation. This is a time for us to take politics out of this. But when I think about the words of former President Trump, to quote him, he said, "Here's the problem with NATO. It's obsolete." To look at that disastrous 2018 meeting when he went to visit with our European allies, visit with NATO leadership, I'm going to quote Senator Bob Corker, at the time the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. To paraphrase, Trump was trying to tear down NATO and punch our friends in the nose. Let's not forget that Mr. Trump was impeached for the first time for withholding roughly $400 million of military aid to fight the war against the Kremlin-occupied rebels in Donbass. I agree, under the Trump administration, we did send javelins and other things, but even his comments of this past week talking about how smart Putin is, how his strategy is wonderful and genius. I guess it takes a stable genius to understand the genius of Putin. I had to get that off my chest, and because it is astounding that we've forgotten that the comments of the former president probably empowered Mr. Putin to think that he could act audaciously. Let's move forward. I want to commend the Biden administration. Within 1 year's time, you restored our credibility within NATO. Within 1 year's time, the work that the administration has put in restoring and rehabilitating our partnership with our European allies. Had you not done that work, I don't think we would have had this unanimity. So I really want to applaud the work that everyone from state to DOD to the president has done. It's remarkable, and it allows us to have this unanimity that we have right now. A handful of us were in Kyiv, about a month ago. We had a chance to meet with President Zelensky, the Minister of Defense, the foreign minister, again, under the chairman's leadership. We also had a chance to talk to the Ukrainian people. Their courage is remarkable, but I have to say I'm not surprised, because when we talked to them, they were very matter-of-fact that this was their country, that they were going to stand up and defend their country. They had no interest in living under Russian rule. They were happy to live side by side with a country that they've had relations with, for centuries. But as a young democracy, they wanted to live the lives that they wanted to live and move forward. This is Putin's war. He chose to do this, totally unprovoked. And when I'm asked in the public, and people say, well, why should the United States be so involved? We're the world's oldest democracy. We were in Ukraine, and we met with this young democracy, these citizens that were forging their path forward. As a world, we have to stand together. We have to stand together on the principles of freedom, of individuals to choose their right forward. We have to stand against the tyranny that Vladimir Putin is inflicting on a country in an unprovoked way. That is the stakes here. That is why I'm so proud of how we've come together as a nation. To my Republican colleagues, I'm extremely proud of what we did last night at the State of the Union, standing up, clapping in unison, supporting the people of Ukraine. Those are the stakes right now. We cannot let an autocrat like Vladimir Putin choose to just impose his will on a country totally unprovoked. Because if we let him get away with that, you know, there are other autocrats around the world that are watching what is happening right now. This is what kind of a 21st century do we want to live in? And we've got to be united and look forward, take the politics out of this, be united as Democrats and Republicans, be united with our allies that share our values of freedom, of liberty, of the ability of people to choose their own path forward. And that's the stakes here. So again, yeah, I'm not going to ask any questions. I had to get that off my chest. But I am so proud of what we've done, what our allies have done, how we've stuck together. And to the people of Ukraine, we are with you on this. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Darrell Issa of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as we meet today to talk about whether or not the authorized use of military force needs to be changed, I think the question that we should be asking today is the exact opposite. Are we, as a committee, prepared to preempt the president taking military force completely off the table, but rather we should be considering a new authorized use of military force against Russia in support of the people of Ukraine and other non-NATO countries now threatened by this totalitarian dictatorship? I believe that that is what we should be talking about, and it is my intent not only to sign on to the chairman's resolution, which I understand will be on the floor today or tomorrow, just talking about exactly that, the terrible atrocities by this president, not this our president, but by Putin. So let me ask one question, which is for our witnesses. Does the president have the authority to engage against Russian forces that are targeting civilians in Ukraine today?
Congressman, the president has no intention of U.S. forces being engaged with Russia forces inside Ukraine.
I appreciate that. He said it very well before all of us last night. I asked a different question. Does the president have the authority?
I would defer to counsel on that, either to Mr. Visek or to Ms. Krass.
One of you please answer. Does the president have authority to provide overhead support, including help the Ukrainians target Russian troops or Russian aircraft that are attacking civilians, unarmed civilians in Ukraine as we speak?
President's authority to use force without approval of Congress is found in Article 2 of the Constitution. It would be an incredibly fact-specific inquiry. Obviously, one of those, he has the authority under Article 2 where it would not lead to war, and obviously we would have to take into account escalatory risks, but I would defer to my colleague, Ms. Krass.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that. You know, the approach that the executive branch has taken over multiple administrations is to evaluate whether there's a national interest that's sufficient to taking force, but then that the president may not authorize under his Article 2 power the use of force that is of sufficient nature, scope, and duration to qualify as a use of war.
Well, I appreciate that. So what I'm hearing is that since Jefferson first went after the Barbary pirates, we have had an argument about what the authorities of the president are. We tried Milosevic for 6 years, a decade after he began murdering people in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. Many of the things that Putin is doing today mimic the kind of targeting of civilians that occurred during that time. During those years, didn't we, in fact, engage in support of with NATO of a non-NATO country in order to prevent the loss of human life? I'll take that as a yes. So the question is, if there is some ambiguity as we speak as to the president's authority to engage to stop the the wanton destruction of human beings and of non-military assets in this unlawful war initiated by Vladimir Putin, would a AUMF be helpful so that the president would have explicit authority should he need or change his mind and decide to use it?
I think the subject of today's discussion is an AUMF to deal with terrorist threat to Americans and the
No, I understand that. I understand that, but to be honest, we only get this kind of technical expertise and people dying in the streets of Kiev very infrequently. So the question is, would that authority be supplemental to the constitutional ambiguity that you all expressed just a moment ago?
I think I would defer to the lawyers, but I would suspect, Mr. Issa, Congressman Issa, that we would need to look at exactly what you are discussing and what you are proposing. As both Mr. Visek and Ms. Krass said, this is a very fact-based determination, and we would need the specifics. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has
Thank you,
expired.
Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
I now recognize Representative Susan Wild of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is to Ms. Krass, I'm sorry. The 2001 AUMF authorizes action only against those responsible for the recent attacks launched against the United States, meaning, of course, the September 11th, 2001 attacks. In the more than 2 decades since then, however, it's been used as justification for military action on several continents, including against organizations which didn't even exist at the time that the AUMF was entered into. Does this administration have specific criteria to determine whether organizations that did not exist in 2001 should fall under this AUMF?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. This administration applies the same two-part test in terms of determining whether an entity is an associated force of al-Qaeda and whether or not then the 2001 AUMF authorizes the use of force.
Okay. And does the administration have a working definition of the term associated force?
Yes, it has 2 parts. The first one is whether it is an organized armed group that has entered the fight alongside al-Qaeda, and the second prong is whether it's engaged in hostilities against the U.S. and our coalition partners.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Secretary Sherman, good morning. My question is about the effect that relying on a more than 20-year-old AUMF for military action has on our allies and partners' perceptions of the United States. In your estimation, would it be helpful for our nation's long-term strategic goals, including our promotion of democracy, to show the international community that we have a robust legislative branch that is both committed to our national security, but also committed to fulfilling its war power responsibilities under our Constitution?
I think that's always helpful, Congresswoman. Yes.
Okay. Ms. Krass, back to you on this term, associated forces. I wanted to mull over for a second what your response was there. Can I assume from your answer that the war in Ukraine would not be a situation that would fall under this definition of associated forces?
Yes, we always have to look at the specific group, but that would be hard to imagine.
Okay. And are there any conflicts that you're aware of right now that exist in the world that would, where that definition of the term associated forces would apply?
So there are a number of entities that over the past several administrations have been determined to be associated forces, and one of those, for example, is al-Shabaab in Somalia.
Okay. And I should also ask that same question of Deputy Secretary Sherman, because I understand you're legal counsel. You heard my question. Are there any conflicts that you are aware of around the world where that definition of associated forces would apply right now?
Yes, and the best example is, as Ms. Krass said, al-Shabaab.
Okay. Is that the only one that you're aware of?
There are others as well, and I'd have to look through my notes to tell you what other groups have been identified, but these determinations are made very carefully to make sure that they meet the two-prong test that Ms. Krass outlined.
Okay. So just to summarize, if we were to use, if the administration were to use the 2001 AUMF to become involved in a conflict anywhere in the world right now, it would require an analysis of that two-pronged test and making sure that that conflict or the parties to that conflict fell within that two-pronged test.
Yes, remember, it's identifying the group, that they in fact are associated in some way to that terrorist threat that emanated out of 9/11 with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and that in fact it was appropriate along the lines of the two prongs that Ms. Krass outlined.
Thank you very much. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Representative Ann Wagner of Missouri, who's the vice-ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a very important hearing. I want to thank our witnesses, too, for their time and their expertise. This is a watershed moment in history, and we're grateful for your service, especially during this time of crisis. Months ago, Putin began laying the groundwork for a unilateral violation of sovereignty without precedent in the post-war World War II era. Utterly without reason or provocation, he amassed thousands of troops on Ukraine's border with the sole purpose of conquering a free and independent nation. It is difficult to express the depth of, I think, not just my shock and grief, but the world's shock and grief for the people of Ukraine, and my admiration for their courage, their grit, and their determination. Republicans have repeatedly urged the committee to hold hearings on Russia's threat to Ukraine, to shine a bright light on Russia's acts of evil before it was too late. And today, with Russian missiles falling across Ukraine, we must take this opportunity to examine the U.S. response to Russia's invasion. In the decades since the bloodshed and the upheaval of Second World War, the citizens of the world have taken comfort in a shared conviction that might does not make right, that countries determine their own destiny, and that peace, security, and respect for fundamental rights must govern international relations. In abrogating Ukraine's security and territorial integrity, Putin has rejected this vision for the world and endorsed a barbaric worldview in which the strong do as they will and the weak suffer what they must. I need hardly remind this committee how dangerous and how fundamentally wrong this belief is. The Ukrainian people are not weak. The West is not weak. The United States and our allies, including the courageous people of Ukraine, are stronger and more united than we have ever been. We know that Putin's violence does not end with Ukraine. This is a threat to every member of the free world. The Ukrainian people must have the resources they need to defend their homeland, and Putin must pay now for this catastrophe. Deputy Secretary Sherman, we cannot continue to hold U.S. sanctions in reserve as a 40-mile-long Russian military convoy approaches Kyiv, and U.S. officials warn that Russia will soon unleash even more violent attacks throughout Ukraine. Is the administration considering expanding penalties on Russia's entire financial sector, not just 80% of it, but its entire financial sector, and imposing secondary sanctions on designated Russian banks to force the world to choose between doing business with Russia or the U.S.?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. First, I associate myself with your remarks about the horror that we are all witnessing. Every day, I look across my desk at a photograph. When I was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, I visited Kyiv after the Maidan, and it's a photograph of me laying flowers at the memorial. And I look at that photograph every day, and my grandmother actually came from what is now Ukraine, and remind myself that people die for freedom every single day, and really applaud the bipartisan support here on Capitol Hill to support the people of Ukraine. Knowing that you only have a few moments left, let me say that the sanctions that have been put in place by us and those around the world, and the actions being taken, even this morning, Malaysia stopped a Russian ship from doing a port call. This is worldwide. This is not just in Europe. This is not just in the traditional West. The ruble has fallen probably 30%, trading at its weakest level. The Russian stock market is closed. The central bank more than doubled its key interest rate. Russian authorities are forcing exporters to sell at least 80% of foreign currency. S&P cut Russia's credit rating to junk. We have, in fact, sanctioned most of Russia's largest financial institutions. We have...
But not all of them. And
yes,
I
I
agree. And there are
understand.
carve-outs for the energy sector.
Yes, you heard the spokesperson for the White House, Jen Psaki, say this morning, all options are on the table.
I certainly hope
Nothing has been taken off the table.
Because with all due respect, Madam Secretary, we are importing the
Gentlelady's time has expired.
600,000 barrels per day.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
I appreciate the chair, and I yield back.
I now recognize Representative Dina Titus of Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to get back to the topic at hand, which is what this hearing is supposed to be about, the 2001 AUMF. Throughout the course of the war on terror, both Democrats and Republicans in the administration have used pretty creative interpretations of the AUMF to justify the use of force to eliminate terrorists and their associates. In many of these instances, areas that are densely populated and often are at occasions where people are gathered for weddings or funerals or meals, you have had civilians who have been the result of an attack and have been casualties. You saw that in Syria. You saw it just recently when the Kabul strike last year. I wonder what we are doing to try to protect against civilian casualties when we go after people using this authority of the AUMF. And I could ask Ms. Krass or Cross or whoever wants to answer.
I'll start, Congresswoman, and then I'll turn over to my colleague, Chris Maier. Protecting civilians against harm is both a strategic and moral imperative, and we very much want to make sure that we minimize or eliminate that from happening. The department is working very hard on continuing to draw lessons learned from situations where civilians are killed, and I might turn to my colleague to talk a little bit more about that.
So, Congresswoman.
So often it's women and children who are the civilians when these gatherings are attacked.
Congresswoman, perhaps you've seen that Secretary Austin has directed a comprehensive 90-day review of civilian casualties, specifically the implementation of many of the findings that have been done by outside and internal DoD sources over the last really years. We anticipate that this is going to result in things like a center that will look specifically within the department on how we evaluate civilian casualties and how we ensure on the mitigation side before these actions occur that all the appropriate tools are at the hands of our operators.
Is there going to be a report issued publicly that we can see a copy of here in this committee?
Congresswoman, yes, that's the intent, to come in and brief Congress on the findings of this review.
Good. Well, I'll look forward to hearing that. So thank you very much. I think it's important that we make that a priority. My other question has to do with Guantanamo. In November 2001, the Bush administration cited the AUMF for justification for holding people who are suspect. Now, under this order, prisoners were sent to Guantanamo, which was at its peak in 2003. It held nearly 680 of these prisoners. Today, there are just 39 left. Just 39 people left there at Guantanamo. Deputy Secretary Sherman, President Biden has indicated he wants to close down Guantanamo, but under his first year in office, only one prisoner has been moved. Can you tell us what the plans are, or how we can expedite this process, or if that's no longer a plan?
It is a plan, Congresswoman, and we're working very hard to move people out as we find countries and secure environments in which to move folks and go through the legal processes that we must to do so. I would defer to any of my colleagues who might want to add to that, but it certainly remains a priority for this administration, and we're working at it very hard. It's not a simple process.
I'm sure.
I would just echo what the Deputy Secretary said. It's an important priority, and we're doing all that we can to work as quickly as possible, consistent with our national security interests.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Representative yields back. I now recognize Representative Brian Mast of Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you out of the gym. Madam Deputy Secretary, thank you for your time here today, your testimony, and for offering your expertise on diplomacy, as I will be asking you questions on diplomacy. To begin, your assessment of just being tactical in diplomacy. Is our diplomacy more easily conducted if America is in a stronger position, and likewise more difficult to conduct if America is in a weaker position?
Of course, one always does better in diplomacy when we are strong, and as the President of the United States said last night, we are strong.
Does Europe's dependency upon Russian energy put them in a weaker position?
No, my European colleagues have shown extraordinary courage. Their economic interaction with Russia is much more profound than ours is.
Define profound, please.
Excuse me?
When you say profound, expand on that.
What I mean by that is that they have trading and commercial relationships with Russia that we do not, as well as energy relationships, as you've pointed out. And so for them to have taken the steps that they have really can come back on them in much more profound ways, even than it can come back on us. As the President said last night, we have worked very hard, first and foremost, to mitigate anything that might hurt American citizens. We have tried to make sure that the consequences are felt by Russia, not by us. And similarly, we have worked with Europeans and others around the world, because it's not just Europe, to make sure that it is Russia that bears the
for instance, to your word profound would be Turkey having a direct pipeline between them and Russia in order to obtain energy. That would be an example of profound in that situation.
I certainly think that the energy flows are very critical, and I think that we have seen a great courage, certainly when Chancellor Schultz announced in essence that NS2 was dead, and now we have seen the company behind NS2 declare bankruptcy yesterday.
We should be able to say
indeed, that was a courageous step.
Madam Deputy Secretary, they are in a weaker diplomatic position because of their dependency in early March, cold temperatures, what's going on. That is a weaker diplomatic position.
You know, I don't just define strength or weakness by economic relationships. It is what courage people have to act in their interest, their national security interest, even if there are costs engaged. And for me, that is courage and that is strength.
I think we find agreement in that, ma'am, but the level of courage is tempered by the amount of dependency upon foreign fuels. The level of courage is tempered, and the resolve of the world by the fact that Putin has nuclear weapons. We would be naive to argue otherwise, in my opinion.
Without a doubt, we all take that into consideration. We all consider not escalating a situation that might get out of control. That is all true.
Said very diplomatically.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. I want to ask some opinion about how you believe the Ukraine war should end. Should Europe and the West divest, Western Europe and the Western world divest of Russian energy, in your opinion?
You know, I think that there's a lot of rethink, and there will be, about energy security worldwide. I think you had heard from the President last night that combined with other countries around the world, we've done a release of strategic petroleum reserves of 60 million, 30 million from the United States.
But no was your answer.
But I do think that the whole world is rethinking energy security over the long term. there will be a transition era. It is not only in our national security interest because of situations like what we're currently facing, but it is in our national interest because climate change requires it.
Should, because of Putin's nuclear posturing, which we could go in depth in a number of different venues, the world demand a Russian nuclear demilitarization following this conflict?
We have long urged that there be a build down of nuclear weapons worldwide. I support and worked for President Obama and his ambition, certainly not in my lifetime.
One last question before my time runs dry here. Because of their invasion, their violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, should we demand a demilitarized zone along all Russian borders?
I think we should consider everything. That is not one I have thought about, Congressman, but certainly will take your suggestion under advisement.
Thank you for your responses.
Gentleman's time has expired. The committee now will take a brief recess and should be back shortly. We now stand in recess. 5 minutes. The committee will come to order. I now recognize Representative Ted Lieu of California for 5 minutes. Representative Lieu. I now recognize Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota for 5 minutes, who's the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights. Let's move to Representative Colin Allred of Texas for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Madam Deputy Secretary, I want to begin by congratulating you and the State Department, the Biden administration, on what I see as a really, truly special diplomatic achievement today in the UN, but also throughout this crisis. I want to say to my constituents in North Texas and Dallas that the response that we've seen around the world, the unified response in opposition to this illegal, unprovoked, and brutal further invasion of a democratic country was not accidental. It was the product of months of this administration's work to reestablish our multilateral relationships and alliances, and weeks of doing the hard work of bringing along sometimes reluctant allies, and your use of using our own intelligence and disclosures of what we knew was being done to both deny Vladimir Putin any kind of legitimacy or pretext, but also to show the world what was coming, I think is partly responsible for the overwhelming response that we've seen around the world. And so it's difficult, while we are still so shocked and still so upset, and every day see such, really heartbreaking images coming out of Ukraine, to not take a moment and just say that the unity we're seeing is the product of true diplomatic, I think, genius, and that our response in terms of our comprehensive sanctions, our import controls, will force Vladimir Putin to make a choice to either continue to execute this war, or to be able to pursue his long-term strategic goals. He will not be able to do both. And I think that is due in part to the leadership that you all have shown. And so I want to thank you for that and congratulate you on that. I, along with some of my colleagues, was recently in Ukraine, visiting with President Zelensky, members of his cabinet, members of their legislature, and ordinary Ukrainians. And as others have said, while I am inspired by their bravery, I'm not surprised. And I just want to tell one story very quickly of a young woman we met named Alicia, who told me that she was, if Vladimir Putin did invade her country, she was going to get her white wine and her Kalashnikov and defend her country. And that's what we're seeing now. And it truly is inspiring. And we have to do everything we can in our capacity to support the Ukrainians in this fight. And I think on a bipartisan basis, this Congress is going to do that. And I also want to commend your opening statement about why this hearing is important and why it is important for democracies to debate war powers, to debate the separation of powers, to discuss public accountability for the use of force, particularly now, as we are seeing an unaccountable dictator use force with no reason, no provocation, and in the face of just a mounting set of lies to the global community that I think has removed just any chance of him or his country ever emerging as anything other than a pariah unless they dramatically change course. And to get to the topic at hand, because I do think it's important, as much as I want to talk about what's happening in Ukraine, I do want to talk briefly about this AUMF that I think we all believe should be discussed openly and in the face of the American people. And just to ask about Iranian-backed proxies and how the administration views their authorization there, whether or not they fall under the Associated Forces rubric of the 2001 AUMF, or whether that is an Article 2 consideration.
Thank you very much, Congressman, and I associate myself. I think our whole administration does. This has been an all-of-government effort, and I want to thank my DoD colleagues who are here today, the intelligence community, and every other agency, Commerce, Treasury, I'll leave someone out, Department of Transportation on the overflight decision that was made. Everyone has been engaged in this, along with all of you and with our allies and partners. And when all of those elements come together, the strength is extraordinary, as we have seen. In terms of Iran, we are not seeking a war with Iran. I don't think anyone here is, I hope not, nor with Iran-backed militia groups. The goal of our engagements to date, including in February and June of 2021, has been to defend ourselves and to deter future attacks on U.S. personnel and facilities. We believe that the episodic individual strikes that have been taken against U.S. personnel and by U.S. forces in response do not constitute ongoing and continuous hostilities with respect to any particular militia group. So remember—
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Peter Maier of Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses here today. Deputy Secretary Sherman, over here.
Hi, thank you. Hard to keep up.
You mentioned in response to my colleague, Ms. Wild, that one prong of the two-prong test was affiliation to al-Qaeda, and you also mentioned ISIS kind of in that same breath. And I know we combine the two of them as nihilistic, Salafist, bloodthirsty terrorist groups, but just to be clear, ISIS was not involved in the September 11th attacks, correct?
It was al-Qaeda, yes, sir.
Yes, yeah, because ISIS was an outgrowth of the Islamic State of
Yes.
Iraq, which was an outgrowth of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which, you know, was affiliated but then kind of split off.
Yes.
I guess that's where, you know, I want to dive in a little bit on those associations, but stepping back, you're invoking the two-prong test after there has been a determination that the American military involvement would qualify as hostilities.
Repeat that. I'm not sure I understood your question.
You know, before we even get into the question of whether or not the involvement of a group could be tied to al-Qaeda, we first have to say that the military action being undertaken by the United States is action that would be bounded by an authorization for use of military force.
So the 2001 AUMF does not authorize the president to use force against every terrorist group. The mere fact that an entity has been labeled a terrorist group or has committed terrorist acts does not bring it within the scope of the 2001 AUMF.
Of course, but I guess just stepping back more broadly, we talk about the Article 2 powers in that self-defense. We talk about the authorizations for use of military force, which come out of that War Powers Resolution, but neither of which was cited in the 2011 support of fighting against Gaddafi in Libya, where we were dropping bombs, so that would be considered, you know, hostility, that would be considered military action, but that was neither done under Article 2 justification nor under any existing AUMF.
I don't remember
I know
personally.
you
I
entered
don't know if Ms. Krass may remember the authorities used.
Yeah, so the authorities used to take military action in the Libya context was the president's Article 2 power. There was a determination that it was both in the U.S. national interest and that that involvement would not lead us into a war in the constitutional sense.
Yeah, the Article 2 usually interpreted to mean self-defense, which very arguably there, but I know that has been a kind of broadly contested notion. But I just want to say I really appreciate the clarity of the Biden administration when it comes to saying that we are not putting American troops in the Ukrainian conflict. I think there's been unanimity in terms of the Biden administration's messaging and discussions on that, as well as on the congressional side, with very few exceptions, and only on the periphery with discussions of a no-fly zone or similar component. But in general, I think we're in broad, near unanimous agreement that we shouldn't be involving U.S. troops in this conflict. And I want to get at that a little bit more deeply, but saying from the outset, I'm not asking what the Biden administration's policy is. I'm not asking what the Biden administration's interpretation is. I'm asking what a president, a theoretical, hypothetical president, could do. Understood?
Understood, but we'll hear your questions.
Okay. Getting to that nexus with al-Qaeda, right? We have bombed under the 2001 AUMF groups that didn't exist on 9/11. We have bombed under the 2001 AUMF groups that were actively involved in hostilities against al-Qaeda, for example, ISIS, which was fighting them in a rivalrous circumstance. We have involved ourselves in conflicts, engaging in hostilities, dropping bombs, but saying that that didn't qualify as action that would be bounded by an authorization for the use of military force. You all said that that the 2001 AUMF could not be justified. And I, again, am saying that I appreciate that that is the interpretation of the policy of the Biden administration. Could a future administration stretch that definition, that nexus? You know, you have Russian forces that have cooperated with Hezbollah. You've had Hezbollah that has cooperated with al-Qaeda. You can take a multi-step jump. Now, it strains credulity, but I'm not asking what the credulous policy is. I'm asking hypothetically, some incredible interpretation down the line. Could that be shoehorned in? Or frankly, could a president say, our involvement does not qualify as hostilities? So I don't even need the AUMF. I don't even need to cite Article 2. I can just do what I did in Libya.
Let me defer to my legal counsel, both Mr. Visek and Ms.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on International Development and International Organizations and Global Corporate Social Impact, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks, for calling this incredibly important hearing. The witnesses, thank you, all of you, for your testimony. And I'd also like to thank Representative Barbara Lee, who led the principled opposition to the 2001 AUMF and has done so for 2 decades. The situation in Ukraine only highlights the importance of reinforcing the constitutional separation of powers and reasserting Congress's authority to declare war. The President has been clear and consistent, including last night at the State of the Union, that the United States is not going to go to war with Russia and that we will stand by our NATO allies that are increasingly feeling pressure. The purpose of this hearing is to investigate the 2001 authorization for the use of military force and establish the parameters for what a repeal and replace would look like, and I'll keep my questions focused on that. First, Mr. Visek, in your statement, you list a number of, quote, associated forces the administration thinks are covered by the AUMF, including al-Shabaab. You later say that any replacement AUMF, quote, should include explicit authority to use force against ISIS and al-Qaeda, omitting al-Shabaab. This week, the administration submitted a long overdue report on the entities covered by the 2001 AUMF, where al-Shabaab is referenced to be responsible for, quote, numerous attacks, threats, and plots against U.S. personnel and interests in East Africa. So what is the extent of the threat that al-Shabaab poses to the United States homeland and not just U.S. forces in West Africa?
Congressman, thank you for that question. I think to give you a good answer about the threat assessment, I would want to turn to my DOD colleague, Assistant Secretary Maier.
Congressman, we view al-Shabaab as engaged in threats against Americans and others beyond Somalia into East Africa, and including American citizens.
Including a threat to the homeland here in the United States?
Congressman, that's best handled in another session, but I think it's best to think of it as al-Shabaab continues to harbor the intent to strike Americans.
And part of the reason for my question is there's now a long list of these different groups, and it can seem that we're using the AUMF against those organizations only because we've chosen to partner with foreign forces and are looking for some justification to fight with them. And so my second question is, Mr. Visek, in your testimony you state that a new AUMF should include, quote, a periodic review of the groups that are subject to the use of force and the locations where force is used. Such a review is entirely within the authority of the administration to undertake, even without a statutory requirement to do so. In the last 20 years, successive administrations have identified an increasing number of organizations as quote-unquote associated forces of the Taliban. And so my question is, in the 20 years of the war on terror, how many times has an entity been removed from the list?
To my knowledge, no group has been removed from the list. Obviously, if a decision was made to do so, we would report to Congress the change in the legal framework.
And thank you for your support of a review, and given your support for a review, will you commit to a regular and thorough review of all organizations covered by the 2001 AUMF, even absent a statutory requirement that you do so? And will you work with this committee to establish the parameters for such a review? And let me be clear, by a review, I don't mean a simple report on the entities you believe are covered by the 2001 AUMF.
We are always willing to talk with Congress about the best way forward and the process for doing so.
Thank you. And just this week, the administration submitted 3 long overdue reports on how the AUMF has been used. The unclassified portions of the reports detail activity in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and Syria. They refer, though, to, quote, other countries where U.S. military actions have occurred, unquote. Those countries are in a classified annex, but I believe the public has a right to know where the United States military is deployed. And so why does the administration believe that the public is not allowed to know the full geographic scope of the war on terror? And we only have like 30 seconds.
So, Congressman, I think we looked at that very closely to determine what we could put into the unclassified report, and we will continue to strive to see if aspects of the classified report can be moved into an unclassified format.
Thank you. Thank you all. I yield back, Chair.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for their time. Secretary Sherman, thank you for being here. Just curious, do you drive to work?
Do I drive to work?
Sure.
I am fortunate as Deputy Secretary to actually have a driver.
Okay, all right. I don't know how that goes, but I'm just wondering if you're aware of gasoline prices at the pump right now. You know what the average is today?
Of course I am, and the President addressed that last night in his remarks and in the release of strategic.
Right, but are you aware?
Yes.
I know he's aware, but are you aware?
Of course I am. I have my own personal
Okay,
as
so
well, sure.
you know that the current price is about $3.60, the average of a gallon today. Do you know what it was at the end of 2020?
I don't, but I am well aware that there.
So it was about
$2.17.
$2.17. It was about $2.07. So that's about roughly a $1.50 increase per gallon since then. And of course, it increased that much prior to Russia going into Ukraine, right? I mean, you probably realize that too, since you do some driving, right?
Yes.
It went there, right? So right now, in this period of time, we are importing and paying for about $65 million a day, $65 million a day for fuel from Russia, right? But that's a huge increase. That's essentially about a $64 million increase from 2020, right? Does that make sense to you? I don't want to. I know math can get.
Your point. I understand.
Okay, so do you just have, you've got a long and storied career. You're involved in high-level things, and I don't mean to demean any of that because we're all busy, right? And so some of these finer things, but they're not finer things to average citizens who are struggling to get by every day. How is it in the best interest of the United States, both from a strategic standpoint, from a national security standpoint, while we're going to ask America right now to sacrifice and send munitions, arms, help in any way or form necessary to Ukraine, to also be paying for the war machine that is prevailing on Ukraine right now by way of buying Russian oil?
As I said earlier in the hearing, Congressman, Jen Psaki, the spokesperson for the United States and the White House, said this morning that all options are on the table, and when the President was asked by the press this morning in passing, he said also all options are on the table when he was asked about this.
Okay, so, but this goes beyond Ukraine, you understand, because on the first day of the administration shut off the Keystone Pipeline, and shortly thereafter, drilling in Anwar, drilling on federal lands, the continental shelf, permitting of LNG, that all happened prior to the invasion of Ukraine, right? And so when we're talking about that $1.50 increase in gas that's at every single gallon that every person's got to pay if they want to get to work, that happened long before the invasion of Ukraine. Does that mean there's going to be a complete turnaround in the energy policy and understanding of the real world as it exists today? Like Russia and Ukraine and Germany aren't fighting over windmills and solar panels right now. This is another deal. Is that an acknowledgement that the administration is going to reverse course completely on this war on American energy?
Congressman, the President of the United States was very clear last night that he understands the concern that average Americans have. His own family was one of very modest means, and he understood this need.
I sure hope so, but
Energy security is a commitment by the President of the United States. There is no doubt, however, Congressman, you'll have to permit me to say that we have a climate crisis that
Secretary,
we all are aware
if you do, and I don't want to interrupt you, but the words are hollow if they're not followed by the actions. The words are hollow. If I can just move on. I'm just wondering if stealing technical information on the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the F-22 Raptor, or the V-22 Osprey, if you see those as criminal acts, if stealing technical information is a criminal act.
I would defer to Ms. Krass and to my DOD.
Now, I'm just asking you if stealing information of the United States is a criminal act.
Of course, stealing.
Okay, I agree with you.
I'm
of
not
course
a lawyer.
it is.
Of course it is.
How about the concentration camps where 3 million Uyghurs are now housed? Would that seem criminal to you? It does to me. I'm just telling you, it does to me. But I'm asking you.
Congressman, this administration has said that the treatment of Uyghurs is a genocide.
Great. Okay, so it's a criminal act, right? How about the illegal harvesting of organs by the Falun Gong?
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Ted Lieu of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks, for your leadership on this issue. The first thing I'd like to do is put in an article in the Washington Post for the record. It's titled, "Biden is approving more oil and gas drilling permits on public lands than Trump analysis finds," dated December 6, 2021. So we put that in the record? Excellent. All right. Now, I just wanted to start by reminding everyone that the Foreign Affairs Committee was one of the principal committees investigating the former president for withholding javelins to Ukraine in order to extort the president of Ukraine. Every Republican member on this committee last term refused to hold the former president accountable. I now want to correct misleading statements by my Republican colleagues today about Ukraine. So, Deputy Secretary of State Sherman, we didn't just give $1 billion of military aid to Ukraine. Since 2014, the U.S. has provided approximately $2.7 billion of military aid to Ukraine. Isn't that right?
We estimate it's about $3 billion.
Okay. U.S.-made Stinger missiles were also transferred to Ukraine from Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania with the permission of the United States prior to this conflict. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay. The United States also provided javelins and other lethal weapons to Ukraine prior to Russia invading. Isn't that right?
Yes, and I'm looking at Assistant Secretary Maier just to make sure I get it correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hundreds of millions of dollars in 2021 of lethal aid. Isn't that correct? Okay. And then in January, the United States followed up again with 90 tons of military aid, including lethal weapons, to Ukraine. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
So I just need the administration to push back on the misleading comments by the Republicans a little better instead of just saying we have to have a classified briefing, because you can say things like you just did in open session and just push back and tell the Republicans they are wrong. We have supported Ukraine. We will continue to do so. Now, I'd like to talk about the recent vote of the United Nations General Assembly, where the nations of the world overwhelmingly condemned Russia for the unprovoked attack of a sovereign nation and a democracy. A few countries did not vote for that. including India. India, a country that is a democracy, that wants to be respected on the world stage, did not vote for that resolution. And what did they get in exchange? Russia gave India 6 hours to get Indian residents evacuated out of Ukraine. 6 hours. That's what India got in exchange. That is a slap in the face to India. And if India wants to be taken seriously on the world stage, if they want to be part of the family of democracies, they need to condemn Russia. It's not very hard to do. It's not like we're asking India to even sanction Russia, just condemn them. So I want to ask you, Deputy Secretary of State Sherman, what kind of pressure can we put on India to do the right thing and be on the right side of history?
Congressman, every country makes its own decision about its national interests. We agree with you, 141 countries today in the UN General Assembly, an enormous vote with only 5 notes, 35 abstentions, of which India was one of the abstentions. But 141 countries voted to say that President Putin has put forward an unprovoked, unjustified, and premeditated war on Ukraine and Ukraine's citizens. Those countries that abstained, we are in constant conversation with to, quite frankly, implore them to do what we believe is the right thing. We understand that countries have very complicated calculus making these decisions. We hope that as votes go on, and there are votes happening in the Human Rights Council, there are votes happening at the IAEA, there were votes at the, or a walkout actually, at the Conference on Disarmament when Minister Lavrov spoke. So we hope as this goes on that every country will understand that this is naked aggression, that this is a president who is acting with impunity to take away the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of a country and its right to make its own choices, and to understand that if Putin can come for Ukraine, then authoritarian leaders everywhere can come for you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Time has expired. I now recognize Representative Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, who's the ranking member for the Subcommittee on Europe, Energy and Environment and Cyber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question for Mrs. Sherman. Ms. Sherman, are you aware of the number of barrels and the amount of money that is sent from the U.S.? I'm sorry, the amount of oil that's imported to the U.S. from Russia and the amount of money that's sent from the United States to Russia for that oil?
I think that Congressman Perry talked about the imports from Russia just a few moments ago, and we certainly understand that we do import oil from Russia.
Are you aware of the quantities of oil and the amount of money that it costs?
Somewhere in my big notebook here, those numbers exist. I don't know them off the top of my head.
Do you think even $1 is too much?
As Jen Psaki said, and the president said this morning himself, that all options are on the table. I know that there is momentum, certainly from some members of Congress, to block import of Russian oil.
I'm aware of what Jen Psaki said, but my question to you, Ms. Sherman, is do you think $1 sent to Russia for oil is too much?
I think that we need to consider all of the options here, given the naked aggression of Vladimir Putin.
But do you think, I agree with you, but does it follow from that we should not be importing Russian oil and sending tens of millions of dollars every day to Russia to finance their war machine?
I think, Congressman, in considering this, we need to think through what this will mean for the American consumer as well. The president said last night he understands that Americans are facing high gas prices at the pump when they go to fill their cars, as some of your colleagues have said to me this morning as well. And so as we make our choices here about the sanctions against Russia, against the consequences that Putin has to pay, the president also said last night that he wants to make sure that he mitigates as much as possible the cost to the American public and to American citizens in their day-to-day life. These are complex decisions, and we're making them very carefully on behalf of American consumers and American citizens.
Ms. Sherman, you're referencing the cost of gas at the pump. What's more important, the cost of gas at the pump or the cost of lives in Ukraine?
Congressman, there is no way that I am going to underestimate the cost of lives to people in Ukraine or the cost of lives to anyone, anywhere.
Mr. Maier, there have been a number of instances of military conflicts that were not NATO conflicts. Just to name a few: Kosovo, Bosnia, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Cameroon, Yemen, Syria, Kuwait. What red line would need to be crossed? How much atrocity must we witness on TV before we stop telling the Russian government what we're not going to do and consider all options to protect human life in Ukraine?
Congressman, just again to make the point, I think we are looking at all options, and we have gone through a number of the evaluations of different scenarios. At this point, I don't want to get into hypotheticals about what might or might not be on the table.
I do want to
And you're
add.
saying military
I do want to add, Congressman, that the President has been quite clear, as I think have been virtually all members of Congress, that the President is not committing U.S. troops to fight Russia in Ukraine.
Mr. Maier?
Sorry, was there another question, Congressman?
So you seem to be saying different things. You're saying you don't want to telegraph what we're going to do. Ms. Sherman seems to be indicating otherwise.
No, I would associate myself with the principle we made at the beginning and associated with Deputy Secretary Sherman's opening remarks that there's no willingness nor intent to commit U.S. forces in conflict with Russia.
So final question to both of you, Mr. Maier and Ms. Sherman. Do you think it makes sense to telegraph our moves to the enemy and put on the table overtly what we are not willing to do?
I think the President of the United States Congress has a commitment to the American people and to our national security and to make judgments in that regard. I understand, Congressman, that you have a different point of view about this. I don't think that we are sending a signal to the adversary. I think by the sanctions we've put in place, the export controls, the forces that we have joined with NATO in putting on the eastern flank under our NATO obligations and our obligations to defend NATO territory, that we have sent a very clear message to our adversary that there are massive consequences for this unprovoked, unjustified, and horrifying war.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, who's the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Visek, can you tell me how many countries we have active military operations in pursuant to the 2001 AUMF?
Thank you, Congressman. I think this is a question that my colleague from DOD, who would understand deployment off the top of his head better than I would, at least. I don't want to prejudge his answer. Would
Mr. Maier, do you have an answer to that?
So, as has already been talked about, Congresswoman, there's been up to 20 countries that at times over the last 20 years have been included in the AUMF 2001.
Okay. Have we added any new groups to the list of associated forces during the Biden administration? Mr. Visek?
To my knowledge, no.
Have we removed any?
No, we have not.
Ms. Krass, turning our attention to Somalia, am I correct that all of the airstrikes conducted there under President Biden have been justified under the doctrine of collective self-defense?
Congresswoman, the strikes in Somalia have been conducted under the authority of the 2001 AUMF, and I know that at least some have been in defense of partner forces.
Mm-hmm. Including the February 22nd strike?
Yes.
Okay. The explanation from DOD so far has been that these strikes were conducted in defense of, quote, commander designated under partner forces. Will the administration publicly release the list of all such forces in Somalia whose defense is the basis for these airstrikes?
Congresswoman, they all fall under the Somali National Army. That's our partner force.
In Cameroon, Niger, and the wider Sahel, troop deployment have not largely been understood to be authorized under the 2001 AUMF. However, there have been multiple occasions under both Obama and Trump where our troops entered into hostilities and the executive branch retroactively claimed that they were engaged with associated forces under the 2001 AUMF. Do you believe Congress has authorized hostilities in West Africa?
So I'm not familiar with those particular strikes, but the analysis that we conduct is whether or not the 2001 AUMF authorizes the use of force against an entity because it is an associated force of Al-Qaeda, and then we look to the international law to determine whether or not it's appropriate to use force in a particular country, whether it be by the consent of that country or whether the host nation is unable or unwilling to provide that consent and defeat and counter the threat.
So are you saying that the executive branch has designated associated forces there under the 2001 AUMF?
Congresswoman, I think in the reports, the 1285 report, we indicated that Al-Qaeda in the lands of the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM, is one of those associated forces that operates in West Africa.
All right, with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Representative Andy Barr of Kentucky for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Deputy Secretary Sherman, I want to talk a little bit about the pre-invasion deterrence posture of NATO and the United States. I do believe that the retreat from Afghanistan signaled an unwillingness on the part of the United States to stand by our allies, which was an invitation to aggression. I believe that a failure to adequately respond to the Colonial Pipeline hack also projected weakness. I do not believe that giving Putin everything he wanted in a New START treaty and not demanding a real negotiation signaled weakness to Putin. But I want to focus on the decision of the administration, which is a real head-scratcher to many of us, to waive the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, mandatory congressional sanctions enacted in December 2019, sanctions that stopped all deep-sea pipe laying, and yet despite that, and despite the effectiveness of halting the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, please explain to us specifically, how was it in America's, quote, national interest to allow the Russian malign influence project Nord Stream 2 to move forward, especially when the pipeline would only further enrich Putin and give him more leverage over our European allies?
Congressman, I think we have seen why this was an effective approach. We said at the time that we opposed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I would note that the prior administration never put sanctions on until the last year of the administration when the pipeline was 95% finished. Let me finish, if I may. But to your point, we said at the time that we did the waivers on Nord Stream 2, that we opposed the pipeline, that we also were weighing it against our strong relationship with Germany, that we wanted to keep the leverage of NS2 in German hands, and we have seen the positive result of those tactical moves in the decision made by the Chancellor to, in fact, kill Nord Stream 2.
I'm going to reclaim my time. I think it is telling that it took Germany to reimpose sanctions before even the United States did. I find it interesting that the Germans are leading on this, not the United States. But let me go back. And I was the author of the bill that ended up in the NDAA, and I know what happened with the Trump administration, and the fact that we had the authorization halted construction. And the fact is that because we authorized those sanctions, the construction was halted in December of 2019. All deep sea pipeline was finished. But the fact that it was 95% completed is immaterial. It wasn't happening. It wasn't operational. It had stopped. But the construction resumed on January 24th, 2021, 4 days after President Biden took office. I believe, with all respect, that the decision to waive sanctions without any reciprocal commitments from Putin was a signal to Moscow that Ukraine was fair game. Weakness invites aggression. It's about Afghanistan. It's about a non-response to the Colonial Pipeline hack. It's about waiving sanctions on Nord Stream 2. It projected weakness. And now we are where we are. So my question to you is, what are we going to do about this massive loophole in the sanctions that we have imposed on Russian banks? What are we going to do about the general license that OFAC has granted in these sanctions, which the administration likes to pat itself on the back, saying that these are devastating, crushing sanctions? Really? When we are continuing to import 600,000 barrels of Russian oil because we have a general license, a huge energy loophole in these sanctions on Russian banks, and we continue to fill up the hard currency reserves of Putin to finance this war effort. When is the administration going to get really tough on sanctions?
Congressman, I respectfully disagree both with your description of history and with where we are today. The ruble is down 30%, the stock market is closed, the foreign reserves are being depleted. These sanctions have had a real and true impact. And
my time is
Gentleman's
expired.
time has expired.
They're depleted.
The gentleman's time has
filling it
expired.
up.
I now recognize Representative Andy Levin of Michigan, the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation for 5 minutes.
Thank you for holding this important hearing today, Mr. Chairman. As we face the largest outbreak of war in Europe since World War II, focusing on war powers is as important as ever for this committee, and thanks for doing it. As we all know, the 2001 AUMF was enacted over 2 decades ago, well before I and many of my colleagues joined Congress. As a result, the vast majority of currently serving representatives have never debated the costs and consequences of U.S. wars still being waged under this AUMF. Yet these costs are horrific. More than 920,000 people killed, 387,000 of them civilians, and over $8 trillion in taxpayer funds, according to Brown University's Cost of War project. Moreover, we've utterly failed to bring about sustainable peace and security as a result of U.S. strategy. Different studies have identified a 5-fold increase in terrorist attacks and 4 times as many fighters willing to use violence to achieve these goals since 2001. I'm convinced that one of the reasons U.S. strategy for waging these wars is so misaligned with achieving our goals of bringing sustainable peace and security is the lack of proper congressional oversight. One of the key missing elements for this oversight is a sunset clause or expiration date, which would provide a forcing mechanism to ensure that members of Congress periodically consider and vote on U.S. wars and make tough calls about whether our strategy is achieving our stated goals. Madam Deputy Secretary, I heard you earlier. I disagree with you strongly. We need sunset clauses or end dates to be included as part of the narrow and specific framework this administration has suggested for future AUMFs as essential to prevent us from being dragged into another multi-decade war. And this AUMF has been stretched beyond all reasonable bounds, and it's time to repeal it and replace it as need be with something appropriate for today. Now, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan should have presented a straightforward opportunity for the Biden administration to revisit the 2001 AUMF. That's what it was about. Months have passed, however, with no movement from the White House. Meanwhile, U.S. reconnaissance and surveillance sorties continue over the country and at a still considerable, if reduced, pace. And the new head of CENTCOM, General Kurilla, has expressed to the Senate his judgment that so-called over-the-horizon missions against al-Qaeda and ISIS-K will continue seemingly indefinitely. General Counsel Krass, if ISIS-K and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan do not have the ability to strike the United States, why is an AUMF necessary when the President's Article 2 powers to intervene at a time of emergency self-defense should suffice to address any far-off and, at this point, far-future threat?
Thank you, Congressman, and I'll turn also to my colleague Chris Maier to talk about the threat that we still believe is posed by groups like ISIS-K and al-Qaeda operating from Afghanistan. The 2001 AUMF does continue to authorize us to use force against those groups to protect our national security.
Well, I want to ask him, but I wanted to ask you as a legal matter. I don't understand why it's necessary. Then Assistant Secretary Maier, if the Biden administration and Congress don't find a path forward on a new, narrow, and specific framework to replace the 2001 AUMF, would it permit over-the-horizon strikes in Afghanistan in perpetuity, regardless of changes in regime and evolution in the groups targeted? Is there no limit to this AUMF?
Congressman, I think we look at this principally through the lens of the threat that's posed, and we still see a threat from both ISIS-K and potentially al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I think the key point that we would convey to this committee is the uninterrupted authority is critical to keep that so that we do have the ability to disrupt threats against American citizens.
All right. I'll just say, Mr. Chairman, that I really appreciate your leadership on this matter, and we've been talking about this for a long time, and it's very important that we have dialogue with the Biden administration or any administration in place, and now the Biden administration. But at some point, Mr. Chairman, it's our duty under our Constitution to take action and decide when we will put people in harm's way and when we will authorize the use of military force. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Dan Muser of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks. Thank you, Ranking Member McCall. Thank you, Deputy Secretary, and all of you for appearing here today. So in April, Russian military equipment was left on Ukraine's border following military exercises, April of 21. In May, President Biden waived sanctions on the Nord Stream 2. Arguably, there are now more sanctions on domestic energy production than there is on Russian energy production. In September, after our disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, Russia conducted military exercises and left troops and additional equipment behind on the Ukraine border. Russia continued to amass troops on Ukraine's border through the fall, and 7 days ago, a full invasion of Ukraine began with only the courage of the Ukrainian people keeping Russia from reaching all of its military objectives in short order. On Friday, State Department spokesman Ned Price admitted that it was clear Putin had used diplomacy to buy time for an invasion Putin had intended to carry out all along. The Biden administration said it would unleash crippling sanctions if just one Russian unit or one Russian tank crossed the border of Ukraine. Even after Russian troops began to execute Putin's February 21st order to send Russian troops into the separatist republics in the Donbass, it took nearly a week before the administration imposed strong enough sanctions to begin to have a real impact on the Russian economy and the ruble. Deputy Secretary Sherman, can you explain this delay that you had months to prepare sanctions with our allies and partners?
Actually, I think you've answered your own question, Congressman. It takes time to get allies and partners to work with us on very highly technical issues to make sure that sanctions can go forward. There was a great deal of preparation to be ready to both try to deter Putin and then to impose severe consequences on him. And many, you and other colleagues, have raised the issues of oil and of NS2. On NS2, as I said before, the pipeline was 95% completed under the last administration. Under President Biden, it is now dead and bankrupt. On oil, the president's working to release 60 million barrels of reserves. Oil and gas production are at an all-time high by later this year. LNG exports are at historic highs. Under this administration, storage facilities are at capacity. The narrative that this administration is doing nothing to free up resources is just not true.
I didn't say that. I said during the buildup. I'm reclaiming my time, please.
Yep.
So I did read the classified offer that was sent to Russia on January 26th, I believe. It was startlingly weak. I don't think it had any chance of making any difference whatsoever to Russia. Why was this even sent? Was it actually intended to get a reaction where Putin would say, okay, I give, let's have a talk about this?
Are you describing the non-paper that we sent in response to Russia's non-paper to us?
I'm just describing the classified document that I read and was sent and was not made public, probably because it was just so awfully weak and had no intention of
Well, if
actually
it's a classified
accomplishing
document,
anything.
then I'm not going to discuss it here.
I'm not discussing it either, Madam Secretary.
Well, I don't think it was weak if we're talking about the same document. I think it provided Russia with an off-ramp to its ridiculous demands that, in fact, NATO returned to 1997, so that current members of NATO had to leave, which we certainly weren't going to agree to, that Ukraine would not be able to join NATO if NATO decided it could. We could not agree to those things, but we did offer them things that were in their security interest should they have wanted to take it up.
Deputy Secretary, we're all in this together. I don't want to have to make you sit there and rationalize how we got to this point and the irrational delays that took place. I do have one question. One last question. The Ukrainian Parliament sent us a letter to Congress. I'm not sure if you have it, but I'll gladly give you a copy. That they were very specific in what they needed. Those on the front lines in Kyiv, people we should listen to, from anti-tank guided weapons to stingers to small arms, grenade launchers, not big stuff, not asking for air cover, all kinds of communication, mainly military portable radio sets and body armor and helmets. Does the administration have this, and is this planning to be expedited to Ukrainians in the field fighting the Russians?
As I said, this year alone, we have provided $1 billion in security assistance. I won't go through them item by item because some of them should be discussed in a classified setting, but we have provided a whole range of those items to the Ukrainians already and are continuing to do so, including through third-party transfers.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, who's the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Europe, Energy, and the Environment and Cyber for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Secretary, thank you so much for being with us today. To our other guests, thank you for being with us. And certainly thank you for your responses to the question. I think that for some of my colleagues who may have never seen some of these back and forth documents, the context that you provided was perhaps helpful to an understanding moving forward. But I'd like to get back to the discussion related to the 2001 AUMF, and some of what I'll be asking has been touched on before, but if I can just ask it in a bit of a thread, I would appreciate it. We've had so many discussions here in the halls of Congress, certainly since I got here just in 2019, about the 2001, the differentiation between the 2001 and the 2002, and certainly have made multiple efforts to try and either kind of halt the 2001 where it is, have made efforts to repeal the 2002, and to create a path forward, I think, as this hearing is entitled. So, Deputy Secretary, I'd like to begin with you. If you could give us kind of to the degree that is possible within an unclassified setting, the kind of current status of the Biden administration's view of the 2001 and its utility, which I know could be a 30-minute conversation, but kind of just a brief 30 seconds, if you could perhaps do that.
Sure, Congresswoman. We do believe that the 2001 AUMF is outdated, and we are committed to working with Congress to replace it with a narrow and specific framework that is continuous to ensure that Americans can be protected from terrorist threats.
And I know that my colleague, I think Mr. Levin, just recently asked about some of the over the horizon efforts that are still ongoing. Could you speak to the sort of ongoing and over the horizon to Afghanistan in particular, the ongoing efforts that are still occurring under the 2001?
Yes, as Assistant Secretary Maier said a few moments ago, we believe that there is still a potential threat from ISIS-K and others in Afghanistan, and so we believe that over-the-horizon capabilities are necessary to make sure that we protect America. Happy to have Assistant Secretary Maier add if he chooses.
Please.
So I would just say part of this ongoing effort termed over the horizon is really to make sure that we have the indications and warning necessary to perceive a potential threat against American citizens. So what was referenced earlier in terms of some of the operations and what General Kurilla mentioned in his confirmation are really predicated on determining where there might be a threat and then potentially taking the action to interdict that threat.
If we were to halt, let's say, for lack of a better phrase, the 2001 where it is right now, so where there are operations ongoing would still be permitted under that authorization, no entry into new countries or, new countries. Do you think that would have any negative impact on your ongoing ability, the country's ongoing ability to protect the American people?
I believe it would be preferable to repeal and replace the 2001 AUMF with a narrow and specific framework to ensure that the terrorist threat in this arena against American citizens continues to be one on which we can act.
Is there any potential risk that there might be expanded need for action in new countries beyond those where we're currently operating under the 2001?
I would not want to get into a hypothetical in this conversation, Congresswoman. That would be a fact-specific determination in consultation with Congress.
Well, thank you. And then as it relates to ISIS-K, you mentioned them just a moment ago. Are there, and again, to whatever degree you can answer this question in an unclassified setting, have there been ongoing ISIS-K plots against the United States that are ongoing abilities under the 2001 have thwarted within the past 3 to 9 months?
I think there's nothing I can say to that in an unclassified setting. I can only repeat what Assistant Secretary Maier said previously, which is this is being able to identify the potential for such a threat or see it coming is part of the reason for the over-horizon efforts.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your answers to your questions. And Mr.
Gentlelady's
Chairman,
time is expired.
thank you for this hearing.
I now recognize Representative Claudia Tenney of New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall, and I want to thank our panel of experts here. My first question is to Acting Legal Advisor Visek. I just wanted to kind of clarify some of the questions that Representative Maier had on the the authorization of the AUMF and the Obama administration using massive military action, months of airstrikes, dropping munitions on Libya. And what is the domestic legal difference between Ukraine and Libya? And don't you think it's a kind of a subjective standard? Is the reason that we're not doing anything here, or that Putin is more of a danger than Gaddafi? And don't you think that maybe in putting together legal language that the vagueness leaves room for political subjectivity and political manipulation of that language?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Looking back on what was then Operation Unified Protector during the Obama administration, the domestic authority would have been Article 2. There was also an international law basis provided for by the UN Security Council, which authorized the effort to protect the civilian population.
My question is, if I may reclaim my time, is there a domestic legal difference, not an Article 2 difference, or you're referring to the War Powers Resolution? What is the practical difference, and aren't we getting into sort of vague territory where this could be manipulated and not clear. And I think the Deputy Secretary referred to being more specific on this language and revamping it. Would you agree to that?
Well, first I should say that if I understand the question, that specificity and knowing what the facts are is always important. And I think in the framing of this hearing, the administration's made it clear that replacement AUMF would be specific and narrow. And just to be clear, the AUMF did not factor into, the 2001 AUMF did not factor into the Libya operation under Obama.
Would you say that Putin is more dangerous than Gaddafi?
I'm a lawyer, but I would say they're both incredibly dangerous and despicable.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary Sherman, can you provide an updated assessment on Russia's Black Sea Fleet and the amphibious assaults on the Ukraine's coast?
I would
You could do that quickly.
I would defer to a defense assessment to DOD.
Are there urgent needs by our NATO allies on the Black Sea, particularly Romania, to defend against the heightened tensions caused by Russia in the Black Sea?
So I think, obviously, in the context of NATO, this is something that's watched very closely. At this point, I don't think this is the right forum to talk about potential Russian threats against a NATO ally.
Thank you. And Deputy Secretary Sherman, there are unofficial reports that this administration plans to rescind Executive Order 13876 that was imposed by the Trump administration and lift sanctions on nearly every one of the 112 people and entities sanctioned under this authority. Does the administration plan to indeed lift these sanctions on the Iranians responsible for the 1994 AMIA bombing, the 1983 Beirut attacks, and is that something that, that you're considering in the Iran nuclear talks?
Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with that exact executive order, and so I would want to take a look at it. I would say that there are Iranian persons and entities that are designated under our counterterrorism authorities that will continue no matter what happens. If there is a return to the JCPOA, we have many tools, so I would have to look at the specific list that you were discussing.
It's titled the Supreme Leader's Office Executive Order EO Trump Administration. It was 2019, but in the event that these are part, do you know if—
I was not here in 2019, so—
I understand that, but these are recent reports that we're getting that this is a negotiating tool being used. Would you support, for example, letting terrorists like IRGC Brigadier General Hussein Delgan, who led the IRGC forces into Lebanon and Syria when Hezbollah bombed the Marine compound in Beirut in 1983 and killed 240 U.S. Marines? Would you let them go free? Is that something you would negotiate into this agreement, or would this be a non-starter for you?
Congresswoman, this is not about letting people go free. I totally understand your point, and we certainly want to protect Americans from anyone who would do harm to us.
Would you accept these terms?
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Tom Melanowski of New Jersey, who's the Vice Chair of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A week or 10 days ago, critics of the administration were saying that President Biden was weak and incompetent because he was somehow failing to impose SWIFT sanctions on Russia, banning their use of the SWIFT currency exchange system. Since then, the President has managed to convince every single country in Europe, a remarkable feat, to do exactly what the critics were asking for, and in fact to do way more than what the critics were asking for. So, of course, everyone has forgotten about that, and we're now moving on to new arguments about why the administration is obviously weak and incompetent. The new argument is that there's this massive loophole in the sanctions because we're buying Russian oil. Now, let me say, I agree we should not be buying Russian oil. I agree with Representative Fitzpatrick that even a penny is too much, though I wish some of our Republican colleagues were willing to say what he also said, which is that this would lead to an increase in gas prices, and that's worth it because gas prices are not as important as the price of life. But let's have some perspective here. We imported last year, this is the number in your briefing book, $17 billion in 1 year, $17 billion in Russian oil. Just yesterday, in one day, the major energy company in Russia, Gazprom, lost 97% of its value. It lost more than $65 billion in value in one day. Compare that to $17 billion over a year. And that's just one company in one day. So it's a drop in the bucket compared to what the administration has already done. Let's do it, but let's have some perspective. Now, I've got a question also related to Ukraine. And I'll start by saying the administration, the president, has drawn a line against direct U.S. military involvement in the conflict. And as hard and as painful as it is to watch what is happening right now in Kyiv and Kharkiv, I agree with that decision. The lessons of the Cold War argue for sticking to that line. But I wanted to ask you about another piece of Cold War history. 1948, the city of Berlin is besieged, blockaded. The United States military starts an airlift. We are flying U.S. military planes over hostile territory, delivering aid to keep the people of Berlin alive. We didn't fire or shoot at the Russians, but we in effect dared them to shoot at us, and they didn't. We may very well face a situation like that very soon in Kyiv, for example. Imagine if the government, the sovereign government of Ukraine, surrounded on all sides in their capital, asks us to fly to airlift supplies across their territory, their country, into the city. I don't want to ask you if you think we should do that, whether that's a good idea. I know you cannot answer that question. But I wanted to ask you whether you think, as a legal matter or a policy matter, such an action would cross the president's line and constitute U.S. involvement in the war, involvement in hostilities.
So thank you, Congressman. We are all very cognizant that the humanitarian disaster that we are witnessing is likely to get much worse. Not only the refugee flows and the internally displaced persons, but just the mere availability of fresh water, food, blankets, activities of daily living, the things of daily living. The USAID administrator and Nancy Jackson, the acting head of PRM at the State Department, Population, Refugees, and Migration, were just in Poland and in Brussels, working through all of the options we have to ensure humanitarian assistance. And you know well from your own work, both in the administration and here in Congress, that we have lots of options that are under discussion or people will look at: humanitarian corridors, ways to make sure provisions get across borders, both overtly and perhaps in other ways. And I think we will have to look at every option. But in assessing those options, we want to be very thoughtful about what will be escalatory, what might lead us into a world war which no one wants to see. And so those are the very difficult analyses that will have to be made in the coming days.
I understand. I mean, we now have unmanned drones that can deliver supplies.
Yes.
And I would just say that the beauty
Very
of the
good
Berlin
point.
airlift was not just its practical success, but its moral force. And I recognize the dangers, but I think it's something we're going to have to confront fairly soon, and I would advocate for boldness in that situation.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Nicole Meletakis of New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleagues for the great line of questioning and discussion that's being had today. I want to echo the sentiment expressed by my colleagues regarding the need for energy independence. Energy independence is national security, and I think it's incredibly important that we remove our reliance on Russian oil. The fact that we rubber stamped Nord Stream 2 while canceling our own pipeline. And to hear the secretary say, she mentioned climate. I mean, I guess my first question, which is, do you believe that Russian oil is cleaner? I mean, and is it worth having us being vulnerable as we're seeing Europe vulnerable today to natural gas? I'm all for diversification, but let's not move into renewable energy and clean energy to the exclusion of traditional sources like oil and gas. My first question is actually related to the United Nations. Earlier today, the UN ambassador said Russia has bombed residential apartment buildings, it has bombed sacred burial grounds, it has shelled kindergartens and orphanages and hospitals. My question is it the policy of the Biden administration that we should be moving to remove Russia from the United Nations Security Council and the UN Human Rights Council, and are we pushing our ambassador to be doing that?
So, Congresswoman, I have heard those suggestions, and as we have said, we are looking at all options. There are procedures, I believe, to remove someone from the UN Security Council takes a change in the UN Charter. So these are complicated issues, but I certainly understand that everyone wants to look at everything to say to Putin, you have made a gross miscalculation. The entire world is united, as we saw in that vote of 141 countries today, to say that Russia is the aggressor here in an unprovoked, unjustified, and premeditated war on Ukraine and the people of Ukraine.
Okay, but is it the position of the Biden administration that they should be removed?
We are looking at all options, Congresswoman. We have not made that judgment at this time.
Okay, well, I strongly urge you to strongly consider that. I think it's important if we want to make Russia an international pariah that we take those measures, and we should be leading from the front on this issue. And obviously, there's resolutions that I'm sponsoring with my colleague, Ms. Tenney, and I hope that my colleagues will support that as well. I got a question related to embassies. Are your embassies, is the Department of State fully staffed, or are you still operating on COVID levels?
Are you talking about here in Washington, D.C., around the world?
Everywhere around the world.
Everywhere around the world is different. I would say we do not have the ambassadors we need, because many of them have been held off the floor even after they've gotten through the Business Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So I would make an appeal that you urge your Senate colleagues to move rapidly our nominees through the floor once they get there. The committee's working very hard, but we need ambassadors around the world, as we have just seen.
Okay. And what about staffing?
Every
levels?
country.
Who determines staffing levels? Does the Department of State or other countries?
We have staff in our embassies all around the world. In some countries, they are not working actually in the compound, in part because of COVID restrictions, and we have to respect those COVID restrictions, which are different in every single country.
Okay, if I could please make an appeal. We've had real difficulty over the last several months with multiple embassies. Going back to Afghanistan, we've had some difficulties with Ukraine over the last few months, trying to help people evacuate, which is what the president and your department had suggested people do. We had a particular case with an American citizen whose wife is Ukrainian, stuck in there. I do want to commend Jeff Vick from your office, who has been helpful. And we are working with that family now to get them home. But Egypt, Jordan, we've had trouble with embassies all around the world. They don't answer the phone in some cases. We have difficulties getting them appointments. And also the backlog of passports that we're still dealing with in some cases today, as you know, was horrible over the summer. We really need people to get back to work. The passports are here in the United States. That could be done immediately and by your department. I'd appreciate your assistance with that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Fired. I now recognize Representative Andy Kim of New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the panel for coming together and taking our questions here. I wanted to start by just sort of a more general question here. Perhaps Deputy Secretary could start and others can chime in. But as we look through the last 20 years, with the war in Afghanistan, the AUMF that we had there, and other AUMFs we've had for other conflicts. I guess I wanted to just ask, if we look in hindsight, should we have had a sunset clause for the AUMF, which would require subsequent Congresses to be able to reauthorize and give opportunities for that kind of debate to happen on a more regular basis. As I'm just kind of thinking through my way forward, just trying to get a sense of what your perspective would be, both from the State Department and the Defense Department side.
So, Congressman, our general view is there shouldn't be a sunset clause because it would interrupt what we believe has to be a continuous ability to deal with these kinds of terrorist threats. That said, we do think that a periodic review that would be legislated would be helpful because that would mean at various times, whatever that time duration would be, that we and Congress would look at where we are and see whether we have the right groups, the right locations, the right way forward. We also don't want to signal our adversaries that there is a sunset after which they can do whatever they want.
Does anyone else want to chime in here? I'll proceed to another question here that's related in some ways. I think one of the challenges that we saw with some of the ambiguity of the previous AUMF was about languages of associated forces, trying to think through what would constitute a splinter group, what would constitute sort of a direct line in terms of aggressor that would be then fall within the aspects of that AUMF. So I guess I wanted to ask, and perhaps this is a question for our legal advisors in the room and general counsels, but I guess I wanted to ask, what do you feel like we learned from that in terms of the use of that phrase associated forces, of the concept of splinter groups in terms of making sure that we're following the threat and understanding if they change names or have any types of changes there. But also, we've seen some challenges when it comes to how that could potentially expand and balloon in ways that perhaps weren't envisioned at the start of that authorization of the AUMF.
Thank you for that question, Congressman, and it's a very good question, I have to say. I think with the passage of time, obviously the longer the threat persists, the more opportunities there is for groups to develop, to splinter, to morph. And so I think what that emphasizes is the need for a standard and a mechanism, if you will, such as what we're contemplating in a replacement AUMF, to add new groups, but also to take groups off the list if need be, and to do it in consultation with Congress, because I think the consultation and the congressional role acting with the administration is important, and I think you sort of put your finger on it, is transparency and confidence in the system is very important. And I think the sort of the broad brush outlines we've laid out are intended to get at that through these periodic reviews. And with that, I'll turn over to my colleague, Ms. Krass.
I don't have anything to add to that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, look, I'd like to keep this going forward, and so thanks for giving us this opportunity. But what I will tell you as someone who came into Congress 3 years ago or so, is that it is difficult for me to think through this situation of inheriting previous AUMFs from previous Congresses and not having the opportunity on a regular basis for us to be able to reauthorize and have that debate. I know there are procedures we could take, but we all know the reality of how difficult that is. So I do understand what the Deputy Secretary said in terms of showing a commitment going forward. But I also see the challenges realistically of having that kind of oversight. And same thing when it comes to the splinter groups and thinking through that, it just feels like a lot of opportunity here for slippery slopes. So I'd like to be able to keep this conversation going. Thank you so very much. And
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Young Kim of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks. And I would like to thank all of our witnesses for being with us and answering all of our questions. The unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine raises many important questions for this committee on the current state of war power authority for Congress. Specifically, Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty commits us to assisting any NATO member who is attacked. And although Ukraine is not a NATO member, if Russian forces attacked any neighboring NATO member country, it would trigger Article 5 and require a U.S. military response. But the War Powers Resolution enacted 24 years later states that force authorization cannot be inferred from any treaty. And use of force still requires congressional authorization. So I would like to ask Mr. Visek, I would like to ask for your legal opinion. Do you agree with the War Powers Resolution that the President requires authorization from Congress to send U.S. troops to defend NATO allies under attack?
I should note that Article 11 of the North Atlantic Treaty provides that the provisions of the treaty shall be carried out in accordance with the allies' respective constitutional processes. So, yes, our laws and our Constitution would drive the decisions of the administration, whatever administration is.
I know this question was asked before by previous colleagues too, but I'm not asking if congressional authorization is preferable. I'm just asking if it is required under law, and your legal opinion.
Well, the legal opinion is it's factually dependent because under Article 2, as I think Ms. Krass and I earlier stated, under Article 2, to invoke it without congressional authorization, you need a responding to it's in the national interest, important national interest, and then also that it does not rise to the level reasonably expected to rise to the level of war based on scope, duration, the nature, and that includes our action as well as the anticipated response. So in other words, would it be escalatory? If the assessment is it would be escalatory to war, then absolutely we would need to come to the Congress.
Well, thank you. Let's move on. I know we have little time here, but I want to ask a question to Assistant Secretary Maier. In your experience with associated force determinations and targeting decisions, does the 2001 AUMF have real limits and boundaries? And are you able to give us a general sense of how elaborate and serious the targeting decision process is?
Congresswoman, answering not from a legal perspective, but from a policy perspective, yes, there are definitely limits to that, as the policy debates that I've been involved in over the years have always taken the legal parameters as a key component of those considerations.
Thank you. You know, regarding the technological advances, such as cruise missiles and armed drones, they allow us to project substantial force without significant risk to our soldiers, and even without them entering enemy territory. So I want to ask Ms. Krass, what are the legal implications of that technological shift?
I think that that's an excellent question, Congresswoman. I think that those advances in technology don't really alter the legal framework that we're operating under in terms of whether one needs an authorization for use of military force. We're still taking military action.
Assistant Secretary Maier, has that relative reduction in our casualties changed the willingness of the President to use force abroad?
So I wouldn't, Congresswoman, want to speak to the President's prerogative on decisions as he makes them. I think we are very focused in all our activities to limit civilian casualties as we conduct military operations.
Honorable Wendy Sherman, do you want to add to that?
My apologies, Congresswoman, if you could repeat the question.
The question was, has that relative reduction in our casualties changed the willingness of the President to use the force abroad?
I think the decision to use force is about casualties, absolutely, but it is about many other things as well. One should only use force when that is the last resort one has to deal with a threat to our country.
Got it. Well, with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and I'm looking at the clock on the wall. We will do one more question, and we'll be out of time. Representative Jacobs is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for the extra 5 minutes that you'll be staying. I first wanted to echo the sentiments of some of my colleagues about the sunset clause. As the chair loves when I remind him, I was in middle school when the 2001 AUMF was voted on, so I absolutely think there needs to be some forcing mechanism for us to reconsider these decisions. I wanted to ask, the AUMF is being used to authorize counterterrorism operations around the world, as has been discussed. I've been very concerned about some of the reporting we've seen around civilian casualties. In particular, I'm concerned about the department's standard for evidence in identifying combatants, as it appears that the department does not currently presume civilian status in the absence of clear evidence to the contrary, and presumption of civilian status is essential to implementing humanitarian law distinction and a requirement of customary international law. So, Ms. Krass, will you commit to reviewing the department's interpretation of this legal standard in the DoD Law of War Manual and other relevant guidance?
Yes, I will.
Thank you very much. And Assistant Secretary Maier, we've talked a lot about the implications of war powers. I want to talk specifically about their implications on Section 127 ECHO and 1202 programs. Folks have talked about already some of the instances of violence we've seen that are actually 127 ECHO programs. The Brown Cost of War Project estimates that there are about 20 programs operating around the world, including in Niger, where we saw the ambush, and largely Congress was unaware of those activities at the time. So, given the risk of introduction into hostilities that we know exists for many or all 127 ECHO programs, and can infer exists for 1202 activities, how does the Department of Defense interpret its war powers resolution reporting obligations in relation to Section 127 ECHO and 1202 programs? And on a related note, how does the Department of Defense interpret authorized ongoing military operations in 127 ECHO and 1202? Is it just Article 2 and the 2001 AUMF, or does DoD think other statutory regimes provide the requisite authorization?
So, Congresswoman, I'll answer the first question. The legal question is better handled by our General Counsel. So, both 127 ECHO and 1202 programs, as you know from your experience on the HASC, are reported regularly. In fact, in 27 minutes, I'm going to the HASC to do just that. So I think as part of that, we do our best to explain the threat profile, how the rules of engagement and the authorities are being applied in each one of those.
I guess just to, since we'll talk about it there, the question is how that relates to war powers, since there is the potential for it to get us into active hostilities, as we saw in, for instance, Niger.
So we don't see either of those authorities as authorizations to use force in and of themselves. They're appropriations authorizations, and so we have to separately look at questions about whether the requirements of the War Powers Resolution are triggered when if the use of force is contemplated.
Thank you. Assistant Secretary Maier, again, I know we've had this conversation, but I wanted to talk here a little bit about what the impact of these counterterrorism operations have had on the protection of civilians, and to what extent have those operations contributed to the recruitment of groups engaged in active hostilities against the United States, given that we know civilian casualties are one of the drivers of recruitment for these groups?
Congresswoman, it's an issue that we grapple with regularly in determining what are the drivers for individuals to join some of these groups. I think our overall assessment is that as we've driven down the threat through ongoing counterterrorism pressure, the overall threat to Americans has gone down. Obviously, in some cases, numbers have gone up of recruits in these groups, but we look at it principally through the lens of what's the overall threat to Americans.
Thank you. I'll just say, after most of my life of these counterterrorism operations, it doesn't seem like we've actually been successful in ameliorating many of these violent extremist groups. And so I think it will be important for us to not only look at the authorization, but what we're authorizing and how effective it is. And with that, I will yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I guess today it was fascinating to listen to this conversation because obviously the President has a lot of leeway under Article 2. But I think we saw today why we don't make decisions. The issue of the gas. Obviously we buy oil from Russia. But if we stop doing that, the price of gas, what no one wanted to say, let's stop doing that. No one said also, well, what about the Russians? They've lined up 40 miles worth of these tanks and everything. We could easily bomb them. We could easily do a whole bunch of things, but no, we don't want to get involved in that type of war with Russia. But we don't have those discussions. Instead, we hand it over to the president. And we have them make the decision, you make the decision, then we criticize it. But the reality is that's what we should be doing. It's our responsibility to have this discussion at the end of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. All time has expired. Let me take this time to thank the witnesses for their informative and thoughtful testimony today and for appearing before us. And I think that this hearing was very, very important. There was two things that I think that really came out of this hearing. Number one, because of the current circumstances of what's taking place in Ukraine, that we are all united that there was one person is responsible for the death and the destruction of a sovereign nation, and his name is Vladimir Putin. That becomes clear, and there should be no difference between anybody on any side, Democrat, Republican, Independent, that's who we should focus on, and that's who should be held accountable. Secondly, and I think that everyone agrees that we have a responsibility. I know one of the most difficult times for me as a member of Congress is trying to decide when our young men and women are set off to war. I've had to have that vote a few times, and I can tell you of all of the votes that I've ever taken in Congress, it is the one that I couldn't sleep over trying to make that determination. But it is my responsibility to do that. And I'm not going to take that and shirk it and give it to anybody else, because the Constitution of the United States says it is my responsibility. And I believe that our Congress, this House of Representatives, this House Foreign Affairs Committee is going to continue to work with the administrations and others, but we are not going to yield our responsibility to anyone. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.